53rd Annual Antique Car Festival. No, we just changed the name. It's the Old Car Festival. My 22nd narrating.
Wow.
22 years I've been doing this, and I'm going to do it till I get it right. My name is Marty Buffalini. I guess you could call me an automotive historian, broadcaster, wanted in 4 states. Thank you, Mom. And with me is David Liebelt, and I don't know what David does. This morning, what are we doing? 1919, I think, to 1924, and then at 1 o'clock we've got the Ford Centennial Pass and Review, and right after that the Buick Centennial Pass and Review. That's assuming all goes well. And right now we are waiting for the first vehicle. And if you'll pardon the pun, if it doesn't come up here soon, this is going to be deadly.
It was a 1929 Cunningham hearse. Cunningham was a very large, expensive vehicle. They built cars in Rochester, New York from 1907 to 1936. This car has a V8 engine. Cunningham built their own V8 starting in 1916. Now, the wood, or what looks like draperies you see on the side, is actually wood carvings, carry over from horse-drawn hearses. Wow.
You open the back and there's a hand-carved cathedral in the back. Is the Pope back there?
No, it's just the mini Pope.
Mini Pope. So, it is.
This is yesterday's Grand Champion winner. 1919 Chevrolet Model FB center door sedan. If you notice on the right-hand side of that car, the door on the right is in the middle. There's no door in the front. On the left side, the door is at the driver's. The center pillars also remove so that it becomes a true hardtop with no pillars front to back.
There weren't very many of these built. Really nice. Thank you very much.
Very unusual car. Thank you.
Driving up is a 1919 Ford T Touring owned by Don Wakefield of Ferndale, Michigan. Behind it is a 1919 Ford Model T Touring owned by Doug Todd of Dearborn, Michigan. And car 217 is a 1921 Ford Model T runabout.
1919 was a big year for Ford. They first offered an electric starter in 1919. It was standard equipment on the closed cars, but the open cars, it was not offered until the end of 1919. And even then, it was an option. It was not standard equipment until the middle of 1926. Cadillac had it in 1912. All 3 of these cars have the optional demountable wheels. You can take the rim off of the wheel to change the tire. Made things a lot easier than having to change the tire right on the car.
Probably roughly somewhere between 50 and 55% of the cars on the road were Model T Fords. They were everywhere. Primarily because they were affordable, good, rugged cars. But even by this time, these were pretty much outdated. If you'll notice on these cars, they still have the kerosene and even tail side lamps still burning kerosene. Most automakers did away with those long before this.
As Marty said, Ford had a little bit more than 50% of the market. Well, this is a 1919 Maxwell Model 25 touring car. Original price was $895 versus Ford's $625, still within reasonable range. Maxwell started in Tarrytown, New York in 1905 by Benjamin Briscoe and Jonathan Maxwell. After 1916, all cars were built in Detroit, actually at Highland Park. This car is a 21 horsepower, 4-cylinder. In 1919, Maxwell was in 7th place in the industry. The company merged with Chalmers in 1922, and Walter Chrysler arrived in 23, and it ended up forming the start of Chrysler. Aha! This is a 1920 Revere Model A 4-passenger speedster owned by Rick Damiani of Alliance, Ohio. The Revere was built in Logansport, Indiana, 1918 through 1926. This was an extremely expensive car. They were always sporty, they were always low-slung, always very sleek for the day. It used a Duesenberg-designed 4-cylinder engine. Duesenberg did not come out with their own car until about 1923. Before that, they built engines for race cars and expensive assembled cars. They claim it to be 100 horsepower. It's 131-inch wheelbase. $3,850 new. A lot more expensive than a Ford. Certainly they didn't build very many. One thing you'll notice that's kind of odd, started with Mercer really about 1916. The windshield is laid back at quite a rake. The radiator actually leans back a little bit. The whole car is starting to lean back, giving it quite a racy look. Certainly much more racy than the other low-priced cars of the time.
Why, look, Dave, it's a Model T.
A 1920 Model T sedan, owned by Richard and Christine Jurian of Beverly Hills, Michigan.
Center door sedan.
They never called it that at the factory?
That's what we're calling it here. It's a center door sedan.
The center door sedan was introduced in 1915, or Ford sedan. That's all they called it. The 1915 was a completely unique body, and we saw one come through yesterday. Starting the end of 16, they came out with this standardized design. If you get to see one of these, the interior is quite a bit more lavish than any of the other regular Model Ts with their plain stretch vinyl.
Closed cars, as I said earlier, because the cars were no longer necessities, they were being used year-round. The closed cars are becoming more popular, so you could indeed use them year-round.
The other thing to look at is that, of course, the doors are in the center. The driver and passenger sit in the front. The passenger seat folds all the way forward, and so the driver has to climb in first. Then the passenger, well, really, then the rear seat people get in, then the passenger climbs around, folds the seat down, and sits because they block the door.
And the other way is through the back window, too.
Yeah, very comfortable for backseat passengers. All right, 1920 Studebaker Model EG 7-passenger touring, owned by Richard and Patty Wood of West Milton, Ohio.
You should explain Curator's Choice. That's the best.
Yes. Yeah, how could this win an award?
Yeah.
Here at the Henry Ford, we encourage and we value very highly cars that have never been restored. This car is such a beautiful example. Okay, yes, most of the paint is off it, but what is there is what was put on at the factory. The upholstery is all original except what they had to cover up in the back that was falling apart. They covered that up very visibly so you know that that was done modern times. But other than that, they have maintained this vehicle as an original, and I have a feeling they don't intend to restore it. The first one up is a 1920 Ford Model T Runabout owned by Ed and Lou Walla of Washington, Michigan.
1921 Ford Model T Touring owned by Don Nichols of Royal Oak, Michigan. 21 Ford T Coupe owned by Bob Bentley of Woodhaven, Michigan.
3 different body styles. The Roadster and Coupe, of course, are both 2-passenger. The Coupe body that you see here actually was introduced in the end of 1918. We had a 1915 Couplet come through yesterday, the convertible coupe. After that, they had a removable post hardtop, and then they came to the standard coupe design. The coupe was a little bit more expensive than the other ones, of course, for the closed car. But the coupe was popular with doctors that had to travel, or traveling salesmen that didn't need to carry anyone else but a little bit of stuff and had to travel all year round. This is a 1922 Model T Touring. The second one is a 1922 Model T Coupe owned by Charles Versteeg of St. Charles, Michigan. The touring car for 1922 had a new body, was a little bit different. Seats sat just a little bit lower. The rear panels were designed a little bit different. Actually, it was a little bit easier to produce. This coupe, again, we're talking about unrestored cars. An absolutely beautiful example. If you look at the interior in this one, if you get out there, again, it's got rather lavish piping around the edges of the doors. It's just fancier than what other Model Ts were of the time.
The windows, there's no, as you see, window crank. The windows sort of, ratchet up and down with that lever that he's using there. This also has aftermarket, not optional, but aftermarket wire wheels. Who made those? Do you know?
I believe they're Buffaloes.
Buffaloes?
Yes.
Yeah.
These things did tend to rattle a little bit when you got on a rough road. Thank you very much.
And a lot of them were rough back then, too.
This is a 1922 Essex two-door sedan. I believe they also called it a coach. The Hudson Automobile Company introduced the Essex as a low-priced car in 1917, I believe it was. It has a four-cylinder, 180 cubic inch engine, but the price was $1,245, considerably higher than other cars, you know, like a Model T and the Chevy.
Well, Essex made a big splash with their closed cars, too, in, I believe it was 1921. Closed cars were very, very expensive because they were very expensive and time-consuming to build. But Essex came out with the first relatively low-priced. I think it sold for about $975, which sounds like a lot, but for a closed car, that was fairly cheap.
In 1922, 70% of the cars sold were open cars. Only 30% were closed cars. By 1930, 90% of the cars were closed cars, only 10% were open.
And then those open cars were sporty cars.
Yes.
These things flip-flopped.
This is a 1922 Dodge Brothers First Series Touring, owned by John Connor of Sterling Heights, Michigan. John and Horace Dodge, of course, started out with a machine shop. Henry Ford and Ford Motor Company hired them to build the engines and chassis for early Ford automobiles. By 1914, of course, Henry was getting going. The assembly line was getting going. He was starting to build more of his own parts and didn't need the Dodge brothers anymore. So they said, fine. And they went and designed their own car.
Dodge really started their own car company before that happened. Yeah, and when Henry found out that they were essentially using Ford Motor Company profits from their stock holdings to start their own car company, they had a falling out. A very long lawsuit ensued, and they ended up parting relatively amicably, I would guess. But when the Dodges were introduced in 1914, their reputation was such that before production really started almost, orders started to flood in, so the boys were doing very well right from the beginning.
The engine's 212 cubic inch, 35 horsepower, significantly bigger than a T, and they were a very good car.
The Dodges had a combination starter generator, which acted, the unit would act as a starter until the engine started up, and then it would turn into a generator, but they were chain connected to the crankshaft, so a lot of starters were noisy back then, but the Dodges had what is known as a silent starter. 1922 Oldsmobile 47 Touring, owned by Paul Milliken of Three Rivers, Michigan. You know, I don't know why this is, but you don't see very many early Oldsmobiles. See a lot of CDOs, curved dash Oldsmobiles, but you don't see many from the teens and 20s.
No.
When their production figures were relatively high. I mean, they succeeded, otherwise they wouldn't be around today, but they won't be around much longer from what I understand.
This car has a V8 of 233 cubic inch, and I believe it's 115 inch wheelbase. It's the shorter wheelbase chassis. This car costs $1,495 new. Again, quite expensive compared to some of the other cheap cars that were out there.
Named for Ransom Olds, of course, but he was no longer affiliated with the company at this time. He left the Oldsmobile company in about 1904 in a falling out with stockholders and went off and started Rio, which were his initials, Ransom Eli Olds.
1922 Will St. Clair, Model A68 Roadster, owned by Stephen Rossi of East Haddam, Connecticut. Harold C. Wills was an engineer for Ford for many years. He was really, I believe, chief engineer with Ford.
He really should get more credit than he does.
Yeah, he really needs to get credit for a lot of what the Model T is. And he ended up leaving Ford, and I don't know exactly, 1919, when Ford was buying out his stockholders. Ford was buying up all the stock in the company, so he was completely in control, and Wills left at that point to build his own car. And interesting to note, too,
Wills was really never a stockholder per se. Ford just sort of paid him off.
In stock?
Yeah, well, when he left the company, sort of paid him off.
Okay.
He was very instrumental in the as you know, in the production, in the design of the Model T, but never really given credit for it, nor he was paid by Ford, but never a stockholder.
This car has a single overhead cam V8. Okay, we in the United States, we didn't really get to overhead cam engines until the 80s, really, okay? There were some others. Duesenberg was overhead cam. This engine was incredibly advanced for its day. and incredibly smooth, incredibly quiet, incredibly powerful. Actually, there were complaints from mechanics in the day that it was so complicated, it was just too darn hard to work on. That's a car you will not see very often. Or another one.
No.
1921 Lincoln Model L Coupe. Lincolns were V8, 81 horsepower. Henry Leland worked for the Leland and Faulkner Engine Company. They built engines for Oldsmobiles. He ended up being hired away from Leland and Faulkner in 1903 by what was the remains of the Henry Ford Automobile Company to be their chief engineer, and they renamed it Cadillac.
If I may, Leland, his bailiwick, what he was famous for, even back then, was his precision work.
Yes.
He was a pioneer in being very meticulous in clearances and tolerances in precision work. He redesigned the engine for the 1901 Curve-Dash Oldsmobile. Ransom Olds wanted nothing to do with it. He was afraid it would be too expensive to produce. So when the second Ford Motor Company was folding, Henry Leland took that engine to the stockholders of that second Ford Motor Company. They accepted the engine, built a car around it, which became the first Cadillac. This is an electric, a Milburn electric, 1922, 1920. A relatively late electric. Early on, there was a real battle between steam cars, gasoline-powered cars, and electric automobiles. It really wasn't until the advent of the first successful electric self-starter introduced on the 1912 Cadillac that the gasoline car gained prominence. Electrics are great, especially they were unfortunately known as a woman's car. Sorry. Because gasoline cars are very difficult, dangerous at times to start. Steam cars could take up to half an hour to get up ahead of steam. But with the electric car, all you really had to do was make sure their battery was charged, get in, push a button, and go. The limitation, of course, was they maybe, if you were lucky, had a range of somewhere between 75 and 100 miles. Then you had to keep the car at about 20, 25 miles an hour, probably tops. So they were great for city use, just to get in and go for the lady of the house. In fact, Clara Ford, Henry's wife, owned one.
You'll also notice that there's no steering wheel inside that, and in fact, the people sitting in the front are facing the back, and that's hard to drive. There are tillers on the left side. The longer one is the tiller to steer it with. The shorter one controls a switch mechanism for different speeds. There's not an accelerator pedal per se that has infinite adjustment. You've got 5 or 6 positions. There are 4 positions on this one. Okay, Detroit has a few more. And you go to that switch position and you go the speed that it goes, and that's it. 1923 was an interim year for Ford. They had gone to the angled windshield on the touring cars, and in the middle of the year they changed the height. They raised the height of the radiator 2 inches. It was a styling thing more than anything, but it also gave a little more cooling area to the radiator. We also see the 4-door appear for the first time. Prior to this, the Ford sedan, as it was called, was the center door, okay? The major difference is that it has a door on the left-hand side. Now, Model T open cars did not have a door on the left-hand side in America here. We only built left-hand drive cars in America. Ford of Canada had the contract to export cars to Australia, to South Africa, Japan, a lot of different places, and so they needed to make left and right-hand drive cars. You build a body with doors on both sides, you can do them both with the same body.
Order.
Okay, the first one up here is a 1923 Dodge Brothers Coupe. The second one is a 1923 Dodge Brothers Series 116 business sedan.
From the beginning, the Dodge Brothers bodies were all steel. The sedan behind us here is really the first mass-produced all-steel body American car. There is only wood in that car, really, are the tacking strips for the top and probably for the upholstery. That's the only wood there, and that's pretty advanced for that era. And they're both painted correctly. That is the Dodge Brothers blue on the coupe.
You also notice the disc wheels.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, yeah.
Ford, if you look at any of the Model Ts from the factory, they all had wood spoke wheels. Dodge used disc wheels on quite a bit of their cars. disc wheel was quite a bit stronger than the wood. Okay, 1923 Nash, model 698, four-door coupe. Charles Nash worked for GM. Well, he was president of Buick. By 1912, he was president of GM. He left GM over a dispute with Durant in 1916.
As did most executives.
Well, yeah. He bought the Thomas B. Jeffrey Company of Kenosha, Wisconsin. By 1918, the Jeffrey, which had been formerly called the Rambler, became the Nash. 6-cylinder overhead valve, $2,090 new. That's a significant price.
Maxwell Speedster. Was this built as a Speedster in that era? No, you turned it into a Speedster. When you got it, what was there? All you had was the frame. Frame, engine, wheels, and so on, and you built. Was the body, I know that back then you could either buy a kit for a Speedster, primarily for Fords, or you just designed your own. A lot of those designs would come out of the mechanical magazines of the time. So where'd this design come from? You made that up. You're making that up. Has the engine been... Has the engine been modified at all? Didn't rebore it. It's the same displacement. It's the same engine. Okay. Were the disc wheels, Maxwell? Okay. Nice job. Now pop a wheelie. You're in for a treat. We got all the campers coming up here. This is cool.
The first one coming in is Ben and Nancy Hardiman of Bryan, Texas, the 27 Model T four-door. And about a 1924 Zegelmeyer tent trailer built in Bay City, Michigan, is it? Okay, now Doug's going to open up the Shenango. Part of the advertisement of this time of camping equipment, in the dawn of camping equipment, was how fast could you set the sucker up? And over in front of Scotch Settlement School is a 1916 Claire tent trailer. It actually just looks like a tent with a trailer sitting in it.
Roads were improving to a degree at that time too. So what better thing to do than to go out into the country or wherever and camp out? So there are a lot of trailer companies that develop these campers.
Okay, Shenango decided they'd do one better, 30 seconds. But you know what? They're the ones that actually might have been closest. Doug, are you ready? Go! There are actually chains inside that lift the top up. Now, a little bit of the travels. The Zegelmeyer here, Ben and Nancy Hardiman, they actually used that on their honeymoon. These happen to be two members of the Tent-Topped Touring Tees chapter of the Model T Ford Club of America. And we are trying to encourage time period camping and get more interest going in this kind of stuff.
Did you mention, if you did, forgive me, but about what eras these are from?
The Zegelmeyer is about 1924. The Shenango is 26. Okay. This is Gay Brennan of the Stittsville area of New York. And this is it's a snowmobile made by the Snowmobile Company of West Ossipee, New Hampshire.
Look at this.
Central Eastern New Hampshire. Virgil White was apparently the proprietor of a Ford dealership, and his blacksmith made up the first prototype of this whole rig. The wheels come off the front, what Doug's showing you there, and there are skis that attach in place of the wheels. Well, Virgil got rid of his blacksmith, stole the idea, and went into production of the snowmobile. The kit itself cost about $395 for this car, and it included an extension to the frame. It included a modified Model T truck rear axle and modified rear wheels, the box and fenders, and the skis that go on the front.
How does it do in the snow?
We go on groomed trails and we get rides all weekend.
You go on groomed trails.
Yeah.
And it does fairly well? Yes, it does. Plows through the snow, steers well?
Yeah, steers very good.
Really?
Yeah, Iverson built very accurate.
The Station wagon we'll talk a little bit about first. These were really used a lot at railroad stations, hotels, to take customers to and from from the train station to the hotel. The deeper wagon, the station wagon.
Ford did not build a station
what I
wagon
thought.
themselves until 1929.
Okay.
But you'd buy just the chassis, or you'd buy an older body, an older sedan or something, a little beat up, and then you could buy the body from the aftermarket manufacturer. The first one up is a 1924 Dodge Brothers Series 116 Touring. The second one,
1924 Ford Dodge Brothers Series 116 Touring, owned by Barry Jensen of Flushing, Michigan.
with the two cars side by side. Take a look at the tires. The second car, the blue car, has very tall rims and very skinny tires. And this was a very common practice all the way up to this point. It was in the mid-20s that the balloon tire came out, the low-pressure tire. These skinny tires run 50, 55 pounds of air to keep them on the rim, and it made them ride a little bit harder. The tire's a lot wider, it's taller sidewalls, made the car ride a lot smoother. It also made it steer harder.
This is a 1924 Hupmobile R Touring, brainchild of Robert Hupp. He, like a lot of automotive pioneers, got his start with the Oldsmobile Company. Went on to work for Ford Motor Company. What can we say about Hupps? They were very good cars. Unfortunately, they lost out to the really started to hurt because of the Depression. And I think they were out of business by 1941, if I remember correctly. This is a 1924 Maxwell 25 Touring. 1924, $795, relatively competitive with the Ford Model T. Maybe this is a couple $100 more than a Model T, but you get a lot more car for this. This is 4-cylinder, 34 horsepower, where the T was still sporting, I believe it was 20 or 22 horsepower engine, 20 horsepower engine. This is really sort of the forerunner of the Chrysler, so they can trace their family tree to this car. 1924 Ford Model T Touring. You've been driving this car since you were 5.
Isn't that illegal?
Now I know I want the police here.
Yeah, 1924, the price was down to $295 for the base model Model T. That's without demountable wheels and without electric starter. It was $380 fully equipped.
Well, when you compare this Model T, and there's nothing against this Model T, when you compare Model Ts of this era, I should say, with some other cars of the same vintage that you'll see out in the field, you can see why Ford started to lose ground. I've said this before, is virtually a 1914 car underneath with very few significant improvements, and the styling did leave something to be desired. And at this time, you could only still get a Model T in black.
Okay, the next up is a 1923 Ford Model T station wagon. You could buy a Model T chassis, or you could rebody another Model T. There were many different bodybuilders all over the country. Martin Perry was one that was very popular. Anyway, and then there were also other bodies that were built by local cabinet makers as well. It just depended on if you had a distributor in your area for one of these bodies.
I'm Marty Buffalini back again. This time I'm joined by Bob Casey. I heard you own this place.
Boy, I wish. First thing I do is make some staff changes, but
anyway.
I mean, I'd hire Marty full-time, all the time.
They're turning on you, Bob. Joe was telling us all about this 1911 Harley Davidson. He was saying that this is the earliest known two-cylinder Harley Davidson still in existence. He took this to the Harley Davidson Centennial is that Milwaukee? Yeah. In Milwaukee a couple of weeks ago. And was arrested several times for carousing and drinking beer. Yes, leather belt driven. So there really aren't any gears. It's almost a variable speed by the tension on the belt. There's a little bit of a ritual Joe has to go through to get this started, which isn't too unusual for an early bike. Here's that.
No, this is a 1906 Locomobile. The car was built in 1906 by the Locomobile Company, who originally started building steam cars, but by this time had gotten into gasoline cars. And it is a race car. It was built for the 1906 Vanderbilt Cup race, which was America's premier auto race at that point. This was the fastest car in the race in 1906, but it had 11 tire failures, and it finished out of the money because of those, even though it set the fastest lap.
And Malcolm, we better let you go. The smoking section is around the corner.
And that smoke there's nothing wrong with that.
I am out of here. Thank you very much. Glenn Miller will take over for me. Thank you.
Joining me now is Glenn Miller, who is not the famous band leader, but is an engineer for Ford Motor Company and is an old car expert par excellence. This is in 1928. The V-twin engine became a Harley Davidson trademark. They still make them today. This is a 1928 model JD. It's 74 cubic inch, which became a standard displacement for Harley. Bought by the Cincinnati Police Department, and that's why the buddy seat. It's also geared so that you can use it with a sidecar if you've got a friend who wants to ride along rather than hanging on behind. Number 280, 1925 Ford Model T Speedster, owned by Robert Kistler, from Elkhart, Indiana. Speedsters come in a huge variety of configurations. Some of them have a full body in the back. Some of them, this is very reminiscent of Old 16, as we just saw. But it is lighter and sportier, and anybody driving one of these automatically looks good. This is a 1919 Ford Model T Runabout. This is the first year for electric starting on the Model Ts.
We just had a couple of early motorcycles go by, and the Model T almost did in the motorcycle industry. Motorcycles early on were advertised as a alternative, less expensive means of transportation. Well, by the time the Model T started getting a little more efficient and got the prices down, you could actually buy a Model T cheaper than you could buy, say, a Harley-Davidson motorcycle.
This is a 1912 Buick Model 29 touring car, four-cylinder, 25 horsepower, and would cost about $1,180. At that time, we're still cranked by hand. I suspect this one's got a starter on it for convenience, and also, quite frankly, people put starters on these cars for safety. A lot of people got injured cranking cars.
I believe this is also the first year that Buick had permanent front doors, possibly 11, but front doors, usually around 1911, were either optional or removable. They had just started to figure out that front doors were a good idea on cars. Some tried little leather curtains on the side, and it kept the dirt and the rain and everything back out, so they became permanent on most cars by about 1912.
Got a group of Model Ts coming up here. The first one is a 25 Coupe owned by M. Scott Miles from Warren, and a 25 Canadian-built Model T Coupe owned by Mark Gennard from Canton, Michigan. You're beginning to see this is the last year in which Model Ts were all black with no bright work on them.
I think also in 1923, the Model T had 80% of all the cars in the world by 1923 were Model Ts. That's in the entire world, so it's pretty phenomenal to figure that kind of market share held by one model of a car. We have a 1925 Chevy Superior sedan. You can see that it's considerably more upscale than a Model T was at the time. The cost on this car was $825. Notice you have much more bright work on it. Electric lights, has bumpers, disc wheels instead of the wooden artillery wheels. Cars they still hadn't quite figured out that people wanted to take things with them in their cars, so you had very minimal storage under the back seat and no trunks yet. It wasn't for another 10 years that they finally figured out how to integrate a trunk into the design of the car.
This is a 1925 Oakland Landau Coupe. In 1926, Oakland introduced what they called a companion car. That was a car to be sold by Oakland dealers, slightly lower price. It turned out that companion car actually became so successful that they ended up dropping Oakland and keeping the companion car, whose name was Pontiac. Oaklands for a while were a very popular car, and this one is wonderfully stylish with the oval opera window there and the Landau bars, which by this time are there for looks only.
Okay. This is a 1925 Willys Knight Model 65 sedan owned by Larry Fitchter from Plymouth, Michigan. This is a 4-cylinder, 40 horse, and the cost new was $1,395. And if you notice when it pulled up, it is very silent. That was one of the great features of a sleeve valve engine. Instead of the typical poppet valves, it actually had more like ports that would open and close. Very quiet. Unfortunately, lubricants of the day weren't up to today's standards, and the sleeves would wear out and they would start to smoke. So the Knight wasn't hugely successful in as far as longevity.
And here we have a gaggle of Model Ts. You can see here what was beginning to happen by 1925, 1926. Ford was looking for ways to enhance the sales of their cars, and the most obvious thing is they began to offer Model Ts in colors, which they had done originally, and by 1914 they were making them all in black, and now it's starting in 1926 you're able to get them in colors again. You're also able to get nickel-plated radiators and headlight rims. You're also able to get things like wheels in both the welded wire spoke wheels and the wooden artillery wheels.
And you'll notice quite a few of aftermarket accessories. They have motor meters, the little thermometer on top of the radiator with the dog bone radiator ornaments below. The green coupe has the little wind wings, look like the eagle wings underneath the motor meter.
This is a 1926 Franklin Coupe owned by James Herber from Dearborn, Michigan. Franklins were upscale, expensive cars, and they were the classic example of a car with being successful with an unusual engine. In this case, it was an air-cooled engine. Really the only maker of large cars in the country that was able to make air cooling work. And like so many cars from the luxury class, they were a victim of the Depression. This is a 1926 Willys Knight Cabriolet. It's driven by Jerry Shostak from Plymouth, Michigan. Part of the deal was that if you bought put sleeve valve engines in your car, you had to hyphenate your name and you had the name Knight in the name of your car. So this is a Willys Knight. And you can see, you can tell this easily coming down the road because there's a knight with a lance there on the radiator emblem, one of the more distinctive radiator emblems of the time.
You'll notice also that the cars coming through now will start having front brakes. Cars up to this time, at least in the States, did not have front brakes. There was concern that you'd lock the brakes up and lose control of your car, which is, of course, is true under extreme conditions.
This is a 1926 Rio owned by Troy Beverly from Garden City, Michigan. Rio, of course, stood for Ransom E. Olds. After he left Oldsmobile, he formed his own company. They wouldn't let him use Olds, his name, as part of the name of the new company, so he used his initials. This is a 6-cylinder, 50 horsepower car built in Lansing. This is a 1926 Pontiac owned by William Kenyon from Middleville, Michigan. The Pontiacs were so successful that, in fact, they pushed Oakland out of the market. This is the first year for Pontiac, 1926, 40 horsepower car, 6-cylinder engine, cost $825. And again, you can see that beginning to be the use of brighter colors and the use of, while the bodies on these cars tended to often look very much alike, 94, 93.
First, we have a 1926 Dodge Series 116. Next, a 26 Dodge Series 116 Business Sedan, and a 26 Dodge Series 116 Business Sedan. Dodge Brothers, as I'm sure was mentioned earlier, was a large supplier of components for Ford. In fact, they built the entire chassis for many of the early letter cars of the early Fords before they went off on their own and built their own cars. The center one, you notice, has the steel disc wheels, where both of the others still have the wooden artillery wheels. In the wintertime, to keep it from running too cold, you'd put a piece of cardboard in front of the radiator, or they actually made some shutters where you'd close them.
Next up is a 1926 Chrysler Imperial Phaeton, and that's followed by a 26 Chrysler Roadster, G70 Roadster, owned by Frank Cook from Kenton, Ohio. The Chrysler name on a car first appeared in 1924. Walter Chrysler had been an executive with General Motors, and he'd left in a dispute with Billy Durant. Actually, a number of people did that. And Chrysler first worked for Willys Overland as kind of a fixer. Their company was in trouble. He then went on to Maxwell, which was another company in trouble. Chrysler not only straightened Maxwell around, but he transformed Maxwell into Chrysler Corporation. Upper middle price cars, powerful cars with what for the day was a high compression engine.
Next, we have a 1926 Pierce Arrow Model 126 sedan. Pierce Arrow was one of the famous 3 Ps, Pierce Arrow, Packard, and Peerless. You notice how the headlights are faired into the fenders rather than how everyone else had independent headlights that would sit on a bar across. Pierce started this, I believe, in 1914 or 13, the faired-in headlights. I suspect this is an aluminum body. The early Pierces from around 1911 and 12 actually had cast aluminum bodies. Rather than a stamped panel, the entire body, doors, cowl, everything except the hood and fenders were castings.
This is a 1926 Hupmobile Model E Coupe owned by Wayne Kaufman from Tiffin, Ohio. Robert C. Hupp was the person who started the Hupmobile company. Began it in 1909. And Hupmobile, again, is another nameplate that disappeared in the Depression. You can see that even though by this time many of these cars were beginning to having all steel bodies, and that the tops of cars were still made out of fabric. The steel makers hadn't figured out how to roll very wide continuous sheets of steel yet.
I have a 1926 Model T Faultless Speedster. Model T Speedsters were a very popular thing to do. You would take an old sedan or coupe or whatever you could buy. There were 15 million of these things made. You could buy them very inexpensive after they were a few years old. And if you were a young person or whatever, you'd buy one and build a Speedster. This was a factory-made body by the Faultless company. There were quite a few companies that made the boat tail. One of I think probably the most famous one is the Mercury-bodied one, but this Faultless is a very stylish body. You can see it's stamped in 2 halves with the aluminum trim running down the point of the boat tail. A very inexpensive way at this time to get a very sporting-looking car.
This is a 1920 Overland 4 touring car owned by Robert Grandy from Linden, Michigan. They call this the Baby Overland. 27 horsepower, 100-inch wheelbase. And at this point, Overland was in 5th place in production. We're making about 105,000 cars a year. Has not been restored. The paint has been touched up where it's fallen off, but this car has not undergone a restoration.
The green 2-door sedan has a very interesting accessory. It has a cooker attached to the exhaust manifold, and they just graciously cooked us some hot dogs for a snack. If you would look in a 1920s Sears or Ward's catalog, there could possibly be up to 20 pages of accessories and parts available for a Model T. Anything from hot dog cookers to what they called Fat Man steering wheels, which was a steering wheel that would flip up out of the way, to mirrors, wind wings, different tires, different wheels, and on infinitum.
This is the last year of the Model T. You could get them in black. You could also get them in colors like the two-door sedan there. Sometimes these were called depot hacks because outfits like hotels would use it to transport their customers to the back and forth between the railroad station, the depot, and the hotel. This is why in the 1950s you saw station wagons with fake wood on the sides, because originally station wagons had real wood all over.
Pardon?
That is a 27 Chevrolet Capital Coach. And then 321 is another Capital Coach owned by James Byers from Ecorse, Michigan. It's really interesting to compare the Model Ts that we just saw and the Chevrolets. These are the same years. In the Chevrolets, as you can see, the Chevrolet is a more stylish car, visually more attractive car. Here you've got the disc wheels, which are very stylish.
Yeah, the Model Ts were always just a two-speed transmission, and there are a lot of situations where neither high or low are quite right. You need that intermediate gear for good acceleration, hill climbing, going down hills. Makes a huge difference. Next we have a 27 Chrysler Model 60 sedan by Melvin Daly from Milan, Michigan. And second we have a 1927 Willys Knight Model 70A two-door sedan owned by Sharon Thomas of Plymouth, Michigan.
This car is actually in original condition. It's unrestored. It's, in fact, 2 or 3 years ago, it was one of our Curator's Choice winners. Behind it is the Willys Knight, again with that sleeve valve engine, which is very quiet, very smooth.
And the accessory trunk on the back so you can take the car on trips. Once again, very little storage inside of a car. And still the artillery wheels, but it does have the four-wheel brakes. First we have a 1928 Ford two-door sedan owned by Ken Frederick from Dearborn, a 28 two-door by Ron Jawornicki from Farmington Hills.
Which is a 28 Ford Phaeton owned by Cookie Fearer from Toledo, Ohio. And Ford considered it such a break with what they had done in the past that they went back to the beginning of the alphabet. Had a new four-cylinder engine, all steel body, safety glass on the windshield, which was unusual at the time, and a thoroughly modern car that put Ford really back in the game. This is a 1928 Dodge Brothers Victory 6. This was an all-new car for Dodge with a new six-cylinder engine. It's the first six-cylinder engine that Dodge produced.
Here you'll notice the length of the hood. They're starting to stretch the hood line on the car, stretch it longer, moving the cowl back. The roof looks lower. The car actually sits somewhat lower in the chassis. The chassis drops down a little bit in between the wheels to start to give it a little bit more longer and lower look. It's actually not that long of a wheelbase. It's only a 112-inch wheelbase, but because of the long lines, it actually stretches the car out visually quite a bit. We have a 1928 Pontiac Model 628 Landau sedan. It's a six-cylinder, 40 horsepower, and the price was $875. Convertibles at the time did not have roll-up windows, most of them. By 1928, they'd still have side curtains. So you could get some of the styling of a convertible, but not have the convenience of roll-up windows and doors that actually sealed out the weather pretty well. Essex 340. If you look at the early cars, they only have one kerosene lamp on the back, and it just started carrying over. They're still out in the country, and there actually wasn't that much traffic still.
This is a 1928 Essex Super 6 four-door sedan owned by Gil Birdsall from Rockford, Michigan. Essexes, if I can say that, were built between 1919 and 1932, and they were the less expensive line of Hudson.
Essex had an interesting clutch. It was a wet clutch, which means it ran in a solution of kerosene and oil, and the clutch facing was actually made from cork. It had small corks that looked a lot like wine corks pressed through the disc, and that was the actual friction material. It made a very nice, smooth clutch. Have a 1928 Falcon Knight Model 12 Coupe. Car number 341, a 1928 Falcon Knight Model 12 two-door sedan.
The third car in this series is a 1928 Willys Knight. The first two cars, the Falcon Knights, were built in Elyria, Ohio, 27 and 28 by Falcon Motors, but Falcon Motors was actually the brainchild of John North Willys, who was the head of Willys Overland, which built the Willys Knights. It was initially very successful, but production of the Falcon Knight nameplate actually ended in 1928. So it's really, that's why these are all have brought up together. They're all products basically of Willys Overland.
You notice the louvers on the two Falcon Knights, they're horizontal instead of vertical, like most of the cars were. The vertical louvers would allow air to escape from the airflow through the radiator, where the horizontal ones were added more as a styling feature.
You can see here some of the body styles that were available in the Model A's. We've got roadsters, we've got Phaetons up there, we've got coupes, we've got two-door sedans, we've got the station wagons. Some of the roadsters, actually all of the roadsters, have rumble seats. You'll see that some of these cars have side mounts on them, where the spare tire is mounted on the fender in a well. Others will have it mounted behind in what we now think of as a Continental kit. They didn't call it that then.
The cream and brown Sport Roadster has roll-up windows, which was a new feature for Model A. And once again has the Lando bars, but on this car they're functional. I have a 29 Franklin Model 135 sedan by Richard Gaskill from Livonia. What do you call it? 6-window, 3 windows on each side. So you can see the amount of room between the front and the back seat on this car. There was enormous amounts of legroom.
And you cannot tell by looking at this car that it's air-cooled. At one time in the early 20s, you could tell by looking at Franklins. They had a very distinctive sort of Renault, almost Renault-like look to them. And what they discovered was that the customers actually didn't like that. Customers wanted their cars to look like all the other cars. And so Franklin went to this conventional style that looks like a radiator, but in fact it's not a radiator because the car is air-cooled. This is a 1929 Studebaker Dictator sedan owned by Donald Howe from South Line, Michigan. Studebaker, of course, by this time all the cars were being made in South Bend, Indiana, and it's a testimony to their production capacity that Ford could just outproduce and beat everybody on price.
We have a 1929 Model A Phaeton owned by Arnold Collins from Waterford, Michigan. This is a Phaeton, which means it's a convertible that seats more than 2 people, but it does not have roll-up windows. It still has side curtains. The little round buttons on the sides of the door are where the snaps would snap in for the side curtains. So if it began to rain, you'd snap the side curtains on. But they, of course, cost more money. Cars with side curtains on a nice hot summer day in a rain, we need the side curtains on. They get incredibly hot inside. People say you could bake cookies inside of a car. It can get so hot.
As a very sharp contrast to the Model A, this is a 1929 Duesenberg Model J town car. This car would cost, the estimated cost would be about $15,000. When you bought a Duesenberg, you actually didn't buy the car from the factory. You bought the chassis, and then you had a body put on it.
This is the car that spurned the term, it's a doozy. And so if something was very fine and very classy, it was a doozy named after the Duesenberg.
And there is a wind-up window in between, and right by the driver on this side, there's the speaking tube, so that the owner of the car could talk to the chauffeur and back and forth.
We have a 29 Chrysler Model 75 Phaeton owned by Patrick Russell of Freeland, Michigan. This is a dual cowl Phaeton. The name comes from the second cowl. You'll notice there's actually a second windshield behind the drivers. That would flip up. That entire cowl would flip up. You'd open the rear door. That cowl would flip up. You'd sit down and pull the cowl down around you, kind of like reminds you of an amusement park ride, but it would give you your own windshield. Riding in the back seat of some of these early Tourings and Phaetons would be a very windy affair. And they're also hydraulic, which was a very early use of hydraulic brakes on a car.
This is a 29 Model A two-door owned by Robert Grandy from Linden, Michigan. It's been in the family since the late 50s. It's been in a barn since 1978, and it was brought out a week ago, last Wednesday.
People are, just like artwork and furniture, are finally starting to appreciate a well-preserved original car. Even if there's some paint coming off, some of the nickel or chrome might not be perfect. You have to figure how long this car has been around and that it's survived in this kind of condition. It's very nice.
We are going to have a full flight of Model A's here.
You notice we have some four doors and then some town sedans. The difference between a four door and a town sedan is the third side window. If the standard straight four doors had what they call the blind quarter, and the rear seat is way back where the blind quarter would be, and so the passengers couldn't see out, but you also couldn't see in. So it was kind of a trade-off between a little bit of luxury and being able to see out. Notice the Roadsters, they have the obviously the folding top, but they also had side curtains, where a convertible coupe would have a roll-up windows. Obviously, the roll-up window would be a few dollars more than the Roadster, and not considered quite as sporty as a straight Roadster.
1, 2, 3. Great. Thank you all very much.
Better go, the cops are coming. There are very active Model A clubs all over the world. They do lots of touring, share information, parts. A Model A is probably the second most popular car to own and restore, probably only slightly behind a Model T.
And here we have a 1930 Whippet, Model 96A Coupe, owned by Ralph and Ruth Doherty from Hastings, Michigan. Whippets were built by Willys Overland between 1927 and 1931. When they were introduced as 27 models, they were the smallest car in America. The connotation of the name, that name, the Whippet, was chosen to symbolize that it was going to be a rapid car. They were also economical. Set a coast-to-coast economy record in 1927, getting 43 miles per gallon.
It's a 1930 Packard Custom 8 Touring. Packard, one of the three P's of Packard, Peerless, and Pierce Arrow. This is a straight 8, helping account for the very long hood. Once again, this is a Phaeton, so it has not roll-up windows, but has side curtains. Originally, is the luggage still in there? He still has the suitcases that would be custom made to fit inside of these trunks. You would open the back of the trunk, and is there 3 in there? 5? This one has 5 suitcases. Beautiful car. Once again, you notice the enormous amount of rear legroom in here. I mean, you could literally totally stretch out on the back seat floor of this.
This is a 1930 Marquette Model 37 sedan owned by Louis Fancher from Clarkston, Michigan. Marquette was introduced as a companion car to the Buick, and in fact behind it we have a Buick Model 50 four-door sedan owned by Edward Christie from Livonia. And the Marquette was a smaller car. In the 20s and early 30s, General Motors did a lot of this. Oakland had the Pontiac as a companion. Cadillac had the LaSalle. Oldsmobile had the Viking. And even other makers did it. Marmon introduced a car called the Roosevelt, and Studebaker introduced a car called the Erskine as a companion make. The Marquette was Buick's companion car. It was not actually all that successful in the marketplace.
It's a 1930 Packard Standard 8 Roadster. This Packard was $2,425 in 1930. This is a Roadster, so it has removable side curtains, not roll-up windows. The beautiful wire wheels, dual side mounts with mirrors. The lady pushing the wheel. Yeah. Rumble seat, very popular at the time. You could double your capacity. If you didn't have anyone in the back, you could store things, close it, and just be out sporting in your Roadster with only two people.
This is another Hupmobile, a 1930 Cabriolet owned by Bill Heller from Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan.
This car, if you know, the Packard that was here a moment ago had the wire wheels, but it had wire wheels that were more like a bicycle wheel, where each individual spoke would be adjustable, so you could true the wheels, and a lot more parts, where the Hupmobile, like the Ford Model A's, had what they called welded spoke wheels, where the spokes were welded in place on fixtures to keep the wheel straight.
And we have another flock of Model A's. One of the things we haven't mentioned, you'll notice that all of these cars have a little cap on the cowl right in front of the windshield. That is the gas cap, and that's how you fill the gas tank. And we can only imagine what the transportation safety people would say today about a gas tank sitting right in front between the engine and the driver.
Some of the cars would have had cowl vents, but since the gas tank's up there, they would open the windshield. Model A's are gravity fed, where most cars that had the gas tanks in the rear behind the frame, by the spare tire in the back, had a fuel pump on the engine, where Model A's were strictly gravity.
You want to do the countdown this time?
Okay, on three. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much.
This is a 1931 Dodge Brothers car. They were still using the Dodge Brothers name, still using the DB logo on the hubcaps. This car would have cost $765 new. It's got a number of options. The side mounts that are on there, the welded wires. Well, no, these are actual wire wheels. These aren't the welded wire spoke wheels. They had four-wheel hydraulic brakes, which at a time when a lot of similarly priced cars still had mechanical brakes.
Car number 491, a 31 Studebaker President State Sedan. This is the top-of-the-line Studebaker, the President, which is a step above a Dictator. And it's, as I mentioned, a little under $2,000, 8-cylinder, 122 horsepower. Okay, the dual horns up front under the headlights were also an aftermarket accessory.
This car has also got the wooden artillery wheels. We've been talking about disc wheels and wire wheels. The wire wheels were actually standard on this car, and for a $75 deduction, you could get the wooden wheels. So I think the wooden wheels set it off very nicely, actually.
'31 Buick Series 60 Phaeton. Costs $1,335, has an 8-cylinder, 90-horse engine. Once again, a Phaeton. This also has a dual windshield. You could fold in the sides, and actually the entire thing would fold in and fold out of the way. If you wanted to get some bugs and things in your face, you could fold that all out of the way and get a nice supply of them. Has side curtains, not the roll-up windows. Chrome real wire wheels. Very, very nice. Has accessory headlights, and actually these are steerable trip lights. When he turns the steering wheel, the lower set of driving lights actually turn with the wheels. There's a linkage connected to the tie rod.
This is a 1931 Plymouth Model PA Sport Roadster owned by Donald Wood from Walled Lake. Plymouth was Chrysler's entry-level car. It was introduced in July of 1928, actually about 6 months after the Ford Model A, which is the ancestor of Chrysler. And it was important in helping Chrysler survive the Depression, giving Chrysler at that point a very full line of cars from top to bottom.
'31 Lincoln Model K dual cowl Phaeton. The Lincolns had a V8. In '32 they came out with the famous K V12. Henry Leland, who started Lincoln, who was also started Cadillac when Henry Ford's second company went under in 1902, and Henry Leland took it over and began Cadillac. When when Leland left Cadillac, he made Liberty Aircraft Engines and then started Lincoln Motor Car Company, which then was bought by Ford in 1921. And this is obviously a Ford-owned Lincoln.
This is a 1932 Cadillac Model 370B sedan. As you can tell, this is another luxury car. Cadillac was trying its best. One of the things it did, it kept adding cylinders to the engine. So you got a V12 before the Depression is out. They've got a V16, and the luxury car makers were scrambling to find ways to keep their market alive. We've got in the archives letters that Lincoln was writing to Lincoln owners asking if they could buy new cars. It was a very difficult time for luxury car makers, and only 3 survived. And they had big companies to back them. Lincoln survived, Cadillac survived because it was backed up by General Motors, and Packard survived.
'32 Pierce Arrow Model 54 Brougham. We have not had a Peerless, but this is one of the 3 Ps, the Pierce Arrow. Factory price was $3,050. This is a straight 8, 125 horse. Once again, Pierce was very well known for its faired-in headlights, where the headlight was part of the front fender. This is a close-coupled sedan, so there's very little rear legroom. You fit in there quite snugly. Beautiful car, dual side mounts, real wire wheels. Same thing. Pierce was hurting. This was the height of the Depression. Not sure how many cars they sold this year, but at the end, in 1937, Pierce only sold 167 cars all year long.
And up now is a 1932 Buick Series 90 four-door sedan from John and Deborah Welby. It cost you about $1,805. This car did not take part in a bank robbery. It was, however, part of a robbery. It was both the victim of a robbery and the getaway car. It was in a dealership, and thieves broke into the dealership, piled tires and parts into the car, and drove to the Missouri River bottom, where the Ray County, Missouri sheriff found it the next day. Yeah, I got it. The commercial stuff is supposed to be today, yeah.
We are now, it's that time to award the awards. And in the 1896 to 1908 class. Our third place winner is car number 8, a 1902 Oldsmobile Model R Runabout, owned by Don J. Baumgartner from Toledo, Ohio. Congratulations. First place, 1896-1908 class, car number 7, a 1902 Oldsmobile R, commonly known as a curved dash Oldsmobile Runabout, owned by Don Martin from Dearborn, Michigan. Now we move on to the 1909-1912 class. Third place, car 96, a 1910 Ford Model T Touring, owned by Eric Edwards of Baxter, Ontario, Canada. I'm sorry, sir, no American awards allowed to leave the country. Second place in this class, car 114, a 1911 Ford Model T. Yes, commercial roadster. Yeah, 1910 Anderson high-wheeled vehicle, which unfortunately broke down, but is in really nice unrestored condition. The Curator's Choice Award is given to the car that is a best unrestored, completely original automobile. Thank you and congratulations. Now, this is the first place in the 1909-1912 category. 1910 Ford Touring, Ralph Boyer, Dearborn Heights, Michigan, if he ever makes it. Talk about milking a moment, Ralph. All right, we're moving on to 1913-1915. Third place is a 1914 Ford Model T Touring, owned by Fred Verbridge of Brighton, Michigan. Car number 2 in this category, or rather the second place in this category, is car number 154, the 1913 Car Dash Nation. That's punctuation. 2-passenger roadster, owned by Theodore Morton of Marcellus, New York. And first place in this category, a 1913... How rude. Just be thankful you won. A 1913 Ford Model T Runabout, owned by Arnold Escher of Gregory, Michigan. We are now in the commercial area. Third place, 1930 Ford Model A pickup, owned by Robert Tamplin of Hale, Michigan. Congratulations. Second place, 1931 Ford Model A Deluxe Delivery, owned by Charles Myland of LaSalle, Michigan. Third place, 1929 Ford Model A pickup, owned by Carl Ruby of Lake Orion, Michigan. Did I say yes? First place, I'm sorry. So we are grand champion. It is the overall winner for today, and somehow I just knew Ralph was going to take this. And once again, that is Ralph Boyer in his 1910 Ford Model T. Ralph, now you have 2 awards. You have to give 1 back. There's only 1 per customer here. Don't push it, Ralph. Congratulations. Is we're going to start talking about the 1930s and 40s automobiles. Yes, this is that 1933 Chrysler Roadster Coupe Boattail CT Series, owned by David Morrell of Dearborn, Michigan.
Oh my, what a knockout.
This is an 8-cylinder automobile capable of 90 horsepower, and believe it, 98 horsepower was optional. Was it a bigger engine? Well, why don't we just see how fast it can go?
Sure.
No, wait.
A lap around the block.
Chrysler started producing straight-8 engines in '31. This is a straight-8 engine, right? First year for the Royal Series, I believe. They were always an innovator, Chrysler, in engineering, and as you can see, even in styling, up to a point. Later on, they sort of lost their styling edge. This is a 1933 Ford Standard Tudor, owned by Marianne Morawski of Livonia, Michigan, who we always look forward to seeing at the Motor Muster.
Yeah, this is the first Ford designed, American Ford, I should say, designed by Bob Gregory, who would later very shortly team up with Edsel Ford, and of course create all those wonderful Fords of the 30s, and of course even into the 40s. This car was actually a sort of a scaled up version of an English Ford and the resemblance is really quite striking to the English Ford. I had an opportunity to photograph this car next to the English Ford out here before last, and it was really a treat to see them. It's almost like the English Ford is about 10 or 15% smaller all over than this one, but almost identical in every line.
Might be getting a little bit out of order here, I think. What we have here is vehicle 23. It's a 1934 Ford 40 Deluxe two-door. 1934 Ford 40 Deluxe two-door. Ken and Linda Campbell of Dearborn, Michigan. Car number 22 is a 1934 Ford Deluxe four-door. Yes, owned by Lauren Moore of Dearborn, Michigan. And 23, I believe that was the first one. Yes, 1934 Ford Phaeton, owned by Rick Lindner of Columbus, Ohio. The middle car here sold for $575. The four-door would set you back $625, and the Phaeton on the end was $510. Suicide doors, they would call them, open from the front.
Yeah. The four-door has suicide doors both front and rear. The reason, of course, they were called suicide is because if the latch was accidentally opened when the car was, say, going pretty fast, why, that's kind of what happened. You got sucked out of the car, and that wasn't too neat.
The first car, number 27, is a 1935 Ford Deluxe Touring two-door owned by Frederick Liptak of Livonia, Michigan. Car number 29, the second vehicle, is a 1935 Ford two-door sedan owned by Chris Bitzer. I hope I'm saying that right, of Wyandotte? Yeah. Car number 26 is a 1935 Ford Deluxe Roadster owned by Roger and Shirley Dick of Saline, Michigan.
The radiator shell on this car, of course, is slanted a little bit more than the previous year, and of course has the addition of these four horizontal bars and sort of overlaid over the vertical texture. That's picked up on the side of the hood with four horizontal bars, and of course these diagonally slanted louvers that we saw earlier, only this time shorter. I want to point out too that the fenders here are quite a bit fuller than they were on the in 1933. All through the decade, we have an evolution of fenders becoming fuller and fuller and skirted down lower and lower toward the ground.
Car number 39 is a 1936 Ford four-door sedan owned by Eddie Morris of Wyandotte, Michigan. Again, we have a V8 engine brought out in 32. This is 85 horsepower. Ford slowly managed to increase the horsepower from 1932. When they first came out, I believe they were only rated at 65 horsepower. This is a deluxe and would set you back $625.
Yeah, this car has a slight wraparound grill. The grill wraps around the sides of the hood a little bit, and notice that the hood now is extended clear out to the front end of the car.
This is a 1936 Ford 810 Westchester sedan owned by James Herber of Dearborn, Michigan.
This car, most designers and design historians think of this car as one of the really great masterpieces of American automobile design. Arguably, it and the 4041 Lincoln Continental are the masterpieces of their decade. This car, of course, is the work of Gordon Burig, who for many years was thought of as sort of the dean of American automobile designers. The most innovative and most instantly recognizable thing, of course, is the remarkable coffin hood line, which is a Burig original as far as I know, and struck the design world like a hammer blow. Virtually every designer around the world who was designing automobiles was influenced by this car. You just couldn't help it. It changed the whole seat. It was a seat change.
Car number 35 is a 1936 Chevrolet. Is a very loud 1936 Chevrolet Master Deluxe sedan. These cars from the 30s had horns that would blow you off the road. This car sold for $640 in 1936. It has an overhead valve 6-cylinder engine producing 79 horsepower.
This car, for instance, has a very, very strong resemblance to the 36 Buick, and in many respects to that Cadillac 33 Cadillac show car I just mentioned to you. The teardrops on the side of the hood, for instance, are right off that Cadillac show car. The fender shapes and even the grille shape hints very strongly at the 36 Buick, which would have been a more expensive car.
The 1936 Cadillac Series 60 convertible coupe.
Big bucks.
Back then it was, yeah. Cadillac had from the beginning been a benefactor, if you will, of Henry Leland's penchant for precision, quality, and what ended up being classy manufacturing. And from the start, Cadillac was always known as a expensive luxury car. Although at one point, I think it was in 03 or 04, Cadillacs were cheaper than Fords.
And I'd like to point out that on the Chevrolet you just saw, the teardrop fenders sort of round down smoothly at the rear. But notice on this car, there's sort of squarish in the rear, a little bit of a boxy shape right in the last 6 inches of the fender. It sort of boxes down.
1936 Ford. Two-door, 5-window rumble seat coupe. They came out in 1932. Horsepower has been increased to $85. This car would set you back $510 back in 1936. The rumble seat was a $20 option on the coupe and the Roadster. We had a restyled front end with the grille now having vertical bars, extending further around the hood sides, new rear fenders, larger capacity radiator. You could have a banjo steering wheel, what they called a banjo steering wheel, for $3.75, or count them, 2 windshield wipers for $3 extra. 1936 DeSoto Airstream sedan, owned by Marty Buffalini of Grosse Pointe, Michigan. 6-cylinder. So Chrysler decided they better come out with a more conventional looking automobile, and they came out with the Airstream in 1935. If I remember correctly, these were produced for only 2 years, 1935 and 1936.
I'm not sure. The door handles, too, are really unique. Notice that they have a rather thin horizontal member, and then there's little concentric rings underneath them.
Slow down. Toot the horn. Got a loud horn, too. All right.
Okay.
Buick Century.
Yeah,
Okay.
the hot one.
Yeah, thanks. This too is an 8-cylinder automobile with 130 horsepower, and this cost $1,187.
Also, Carlo Curtis, who was president of General Motors later, during these years was vice president in charge of Buick, and he was an extremely aggressive man and intensely interested in the marketing and the styling of the cars. So he put a lot of pressure on Harley Earl to give him good-looking cars, and I think Earl often responded. He seemed to, I think Earl had a soft spot for Buick. He kind of gave Buick some of his niftiest ideas, possibly with Curtis twisting his arm to do so.
1938 Chrysler Royale, 4-door. This is a 6-cylinder, 95 horsepower car, sold for $1,000 back in 1938. Prices are still being held down relatively, but things are starting to improve, in part because of the Franklin Roosevelt's pushing for and winning the Lend-Lease Act, which got people back to work making war materiel for Britain and for Russia also.
I would like to point out that Chrysler styling was very different in character from General Motors and also from Ford. Each of the big three at that time had their own very distinct looks. One thing I point out that I think is the key to Chrysler's looks is a little more softly rounded lines, very subtly more soft than GM or Ford.
1937 Rolls-Royce P3 Formal Landaulet. It obviously was made for the European market since it has right-hand drive. My guess is, correct me if I'm wrong, Rick, that center of the top and the back portion of the top completely fold out, down, and remove. So what would you do is you would buy the chassis and really almost everything from the cowl forward. And then you would send it off to your custom body builder, and you would, together with the builder, work out the design you liked, and he would build it. Who built this body? Do you know, Rick? I'm sorry? Parker? Barker. Okay.
During that era.
So, Rick, do you have any idea what the chassis, just the chassis and undercarriage alone would cost before we get into the body work? $25,000 and $30,000 in 1937. 1938 Ford Standard Tudor Sedan V8, Richard Byrd, Westland, Michigan. Some major, I think, styling changes going on here that Bill can probably speak to more intelligently than I can.
Well, the grill, of course, has drastically changed from 37. It is reminiscent of the 37, and there may even be some interchangeable parts. Certainly the front fenders appear to be the same as the 37, and I'm not sure about the rear fender. Yeah, maybe the rear, I'm not so sure. But the grill wraps around into the hood in a very dramatic way. This idea of wrapping the hood around the corner probably came from the influence of the Cord sedan that we saw earlier, although this obviously happens up higher on the car. Here we go, 38 Chevy.
Car number 54, 1938 Chevrolet Master Deluxe sedan owned by Jerry Claus of Sterling Heights, Michigan. Jerry, why don't you move up a little bit so the people on the other side can see it too. This costs $745 new. This has the highest trim level and it features bumper guards, twin tail lamps.
Notice the sort of what I call a speed whisker coming off of the catwalk area and going back into the door.
Catwalk area.
The catwalk area is the area between the fender and the hood. I have no idea how it got that name. Maybe cats, cozied up to the engine to keep warm in the winter. I don't know. 1938
Pontiac Deluxe 8 convertible sedan. $1,353 new, 100 horsepower. By virtue of the fact, as you'll see in this car, there are pillars, I believe those are removable, with crank-up windows that will crank up into the channels of the removable pillar and up into a channel up on the top of the car, and really affords a pretty good weather-tight seal in all sorts of weather.
Yeah, just a note about the famous silver streaks on the hood.
Oh, yeah.
They were introduced in Pontiac, I believe, in 1935, and they're usually credited to a guy named Frank Hershey, who was a chief designer of Pontiac in those years. Later on, became designer in Buick. This Indian with the sort of stylized headdress peeling back is really an excellent example of so-called Art Deco design in the 30s.
This is a 1939 Chevrolet Master Deluxe Sport Sedan owned by William Mannion of Clarkston, Michigan. $766 new. Has the integrated trunk. What's under the hood on this? Straight six? Straight six? What's the horse?
85.
85.
This car is one of the first Chevys to get the squared off fenders, the fenders that are squared off in the rear that we saw on Cadillac as early as 35, 34. Here they finally get to Chevy. The grill, the wraparound grill here too, is very reminiscent of the 39 Cadillac. Actually, Earl had a policy in those days that the designers in one studio could not go into any other studio. In other words, if you were a designer in Chevrolet and he caught you in Cadillac, you were fired right then and there.
This is a 1939 Cadillac 75 sedan owned by Louis Maludi of Northville, Michigan. This was priced at $3,100. Had a V8 engine in it capable of producing 140 horsepower.
One beautiful feature of this car is what the designers referred to at the time as catwalk cooling. Notice the catwalk areas between the fender and the hood have vertical grills of their own that wrap back onto the catwalk. That was considered the epitome of high style at that time.
This is a 1940 Mercury Coupe owned by Stan Reynolds of Grass Lake, Michigan. 8 cylinders, $1,050. And these were really meant to compete with the Oldsmobile and Dodge on the higher end and lower-priced Buick and Chevy.
Edsel tried to develop a line of a tiered line of products like General Motors had, but he finally prevailed upon his father to introduce the Mercury line, and as soon as he did that, then Mercury really became the stepping stone between the Ford and the Lincoln, and Ford had a three-tiered marketing system that it's had ever since.
This is the coupe back here, owned by Silver Leach of Windsor, Ontario. In front of it is a 1940 Hudson Super 6 four-door sedan owned by John Northrup of Shelby Township, Michigan. First year for sealed beam headlights. Yeah, we're starting to get into the sealed beam headlight era, whereas before you had to remove the lens and replace a filament bulb for your headlamp, really for all your lamps.
Designers were free to come up with uniquely shaped headlamps up to this time. Once the SAE standards then you were stuck with the absolute round and the exact same size, and of course the attitude of the headlamp had to be, perfectly vertical and so on. These cars are both the work of a man named Frank Spring, who was Hudson's chief designer for a number of years.
This is car number 90. That's an affirmative. I speak horn.
Yeah.
1944 Tudor sedan owned by Steve Murawski of White Lake, Michigan. 1944 deluxe convertible coupe owned by Mary and Mike Johnston of Oxford, Michigan. Let's start with the coupe. 8 cylinders, 85 horsepower, $850. $850, 85 horsepower. All of these using the tried and true 1932 developed V8 engine, but with the horsepower again increased.
But interestingly enough, the two-door was bought mostly by young people with children, and they thought it was much safer to have a two-door than a four-door. This is, of course, before electronic locks and that sort of thing. And the two-door model outsold the four-door by a very large margin in these years.
This is a 1940 Packard 110 touring sedan owned by Jack Olson of Novi, Michigan. This is a 6-cylinder developing 100 horsepower. This is a four-door, so I believe it sold for $996, brand spanking new.
A very prestigious automobile, of course, in the 40s. I don't know exactly when Cadillac passed Packard in sales. I don't remember the exact year, but Packard was the prestige automobile certainly through much of the 30s. And they were the big styling feature of Packard's was this tall vertical radiator shell with the unique shape to the top of it, sort of crested in the middle.
109 is a 1941 Packard 110 two-door sedan owned by Ben Harwood and Gene of New Boston, Michigan. Is a 1941 Packard 120 four-door owned by Dick Roth of Shelby Township, Michigan. First car is 6-cylinder, second car is 8-cylinder. Horsepower is 120 on this car and 100 on that one.
Extremely quiet, well-mannered, every proportion carefully thought out. The trim is very elegant and detailing is superb. But the fit and finish of even the 120 is really extraordinary. Yes. You notice beautiful little, I'll call them speed whiskers, 4 of them on the lower sides of the fenders here, are just, they're just beautifully crafted. It's quite different from a stamped molding that would just be sort of slugged on the side with some clips. This is really a beautifully inset detail. Yeah, I have the Roadmaster four-door convertible owned by Richard Smith of Rochester, Michigan.
And then this is a 1941 Buick 41 four-door sedan owned by John Sterling of Livonia, Michigan.
The torpedo body is epitomized by the four-door convertible you see ahead. The the top of the car sits on a kind of a bulging lower that runs all the way through from the hood clear out the deck. The rear deck is actually part of the whole lower body of the car and sort of, completes the lozenge shape, you might say. But the fastback over here is a very different animal. The overall profile of the car slopes down at the rear to form one shape. Now, one thing that starts right about this time, I think in 40 and 41, is Harley Earl's new domed hood look. Notice at the front of these hoods, it was sort of a dome look, almost like a helmet. And it became a very strong GM trademark, as opposed to the Ford more prow-like look, like an inverted canoe on the Lincoln.
106 is a 1941 Ford Super Deluxe convertible owned by Alfred Rentschler of Ann Arbor, Michigan. $950, 90 horsepower, still using that now almost 10-year-old V8 engine that was produced in 1932. This is the first year for the availability of the L-head 6-cylinder engine. Bigger than the V8, rated at 90 horsepower.
It's just a beautifully unified design, and it also has a kind of a strong, muscly quality about it. I've always liked this car. It's fully packed shapes. All the shapes intersect at sharp creases. There's no fillets. My word again there, except a little tiny fillet at the base of the windshield, but everything else intersects at creases. That makes the shape seem to me to be very powerful and sort of packed.
Is a 1941 Cadillac 62 convertible owned by Claude White of Holly, Michigan. V8 engine, 150 horsepower.
Bill Mitchell was in charge of Cadillac Studio when this car was done, and this is pure Bill Mitchell, the whole car. I just see his touches all over for it. Full suitcase fenders now, first front and rear, and the fuselage going all the way through. This car was a very, very important car for Cadillac, style-wise. You know, it really launched them out into a very clear styling position that was very different from Lincoln, and and Packard too, and that's what they needed.
What do we got here? We have a 1942 Chevrolet Special Deluxe Business Coupe owned by Jim Brady of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Oh, let's see, 6-cylinder, 90 horsepower. An option on all Chevys for that year, an option was a signal-seeking radio, it says. You have it? You have the option? You gotta get the tubes, yeah, it's a tube radio warmed up first.
I'm going to guess that the bright work around the windows was probably part of the option, certainly, and possibly this long belt molding. Yeah.
Made some major strides styling-wise with
sure did.
122 is a 1947 Chevrolet Style Master Sports Coupe owned by Scott Shoemaker of Dexter, Michigan. 121, yes, is a 1941 Cadillac 62 Series owned by Dan Summer of Novi, Michigan. 1941 Buick Super Convertible owned by Clifford Harold of Howell, Michigan. Go.
The 42 that was just here, I should have pointed out that was the first year that GM started putting extensions of the front fender onto the door, and you can see that in the Chevy. Then on the Cadillac right behind it, of course, you see a much larger extension on the door, which is, of course, appropriate to a higher priced car. But then on the Buick, the third car back, you see that the designers, Harley Earl's guys, have extended the fender not only back through the door, but even to the rear fender. And this was first occurred on cars in 42, and then after the war, when these bodies were carried over, such as these, why they continued until the all-new bodies in 48 and 49.
1947 Ford Super Deluxe Convertible owned by Fred and Carl Hoffman of Chelsea, Michigan.
Here we have that same beautiful body we saw in the 41 Ford, made after the war, of course, and with several refinements. Certainly the grille now is the new full-width lower type grille that modern cars had at that time, with very bold bars. In this case, maybe even bolder than we saw in the Buicks. They're horizontal, of course, and I think there's 3 big bold horizontal, and then one on top that has a little sort of a crown-like thing in the center of it.
The demand for automobiles is almost hard to fathom now, because you have to realize that cars were not produced from 1942 until 1945. Really nice.
This is a beautiful car. Notice the door handle is integrated into the full-length belt molding, which is kind of a nice touch. And also another styling touch is the little bulge at the bottom of the door that reaches out and covers the running board.
1947 Chrysler Windsor Coupe owned by Ken and Jean May of Milan, Michigan.
Ken doesn't need sunglasses because he's got that big visor out there to shade his eyes.
Semi-automatic transmission, has fluid drive.
One styling approach which Chrysler took that's very different from GM's, the 3 GM cars we just saw, is that the evolution was clearly toward taking the fenders and blending them into the body. But Chrysler, instead of adding fender extensions to the doors, they actually reshaped the door so that the end of the fender blends back into the door. They explained it.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
This has a full-width head crate grill that wraps around the corners, clear back to the wheel cuts.
What happened? Your spring wind down? This is a 1947 Crossley. Two-door sedan owned by Jeff Ryder of Troy, Michigan.
Crossley radios were a big standard, like Philco when I was
Philco radios.
Sure.
And being a good businessman after the war, if there's a demand, you try and fill it.
And he mentions that he thinks that the reason that the sides of this car are so flat was because Powell had an idea of shipping them in a truck of a certain size.
There's a lot of room in there. Because you're over 6, aren't you, Jeff? Yeah, see?
Wow. Holy
4 guys and a case of beer.
Yeah.
Okay, but what's the engine there? 44 cubic inch, 26.5 horsepower. That half makes all the difference. 4-cylinder overhead cam.
It's a very high revving engine for that time, wasn't it? This is the Scotsman. This is a Scotsman. This is another one.
Okay. Where are we?
I can tell by that plaid. Yeah, this is an example, of course, of the Chrysler styling that we saw before, where the front fender blends out into the door, and also a particularly graceful car. Now, this is an example of Chrysler's filleting. Notice the fillet between the hood and the catwalk, and between the catwalk and the fender, between the rear deck and the rear fender. Those soft little filleting forms in there were characteristic of Chrysler, and gave it a unique quality that I think most people, couldn't identify. They couldn't tell you why it was different, but they'd know it if they saw it. Dove gray, beautiful.
Italian gray.
Oh, here comes. This is not Dove gray. Okay.
This is a 1948 Fiat Topolino two-door convertible owned by Ken Becker.
Well, by coincidence, this happens to have been my first car that I ever owned in my whole life.
Really?
Was a 48 Fiat Topolino.
Really?
Yeah.
Go for it.
It's an amazing car. First of all those hood louvers out there that you see on the hood, there's no engine under there. Actually, Mr. Becker's legs are under there. The engine is ahead of that, underneath the front part of the hood, which opens up. The car was tremendously popular in Italy, of course. There were literally millions of them running all over Rome and other Italian cities in the 40s and the 50s. It was designed by a man named Dante Giacosa, who's considered sort of the dean of Italian automobile designers. And I will say that there's nothing harder to design than a small car to make it look good. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Rev it up. Rev it up. All right. That has, I think, 16 and a half horsepower, and I don't know if the half is the front half or the back half. Thank you.
1948 Packard Super 8 touring sedan owned by George Foley of Troy, Michigan.
This is the old Clipper body, the basic body shell and cowl and all, and glass and so on deck, but very cleverly changed with new doors and fenders that flow all the way through, thus modernizing the car drastically without an all-new body. One of the few post-war cars that succeeded in pulling that off.
128 is, yes, 1948 Chevrolet Fleetmaster station wagon owned by Jim and Dorothy Bartish. Let me see.
I think it's amazing how they made that plastic look just like wood. Isn't that remarkable? Just remarkable. Yeah.
This is the last year of the wood wagons for Chevrolet, and the heaviest and most expensive model for them. And this really is all wood body, except for the front and the fenders and so on. These were used, there are 3 seats there. A lot of times these were used not only for personal passenger use, but a lot of times they were used, hotels would pick up guests at the train station and transport them to their hotel. 1948 Ford Super Deluxe Business Coupe owned by Charles Lyles and Gale of Walled Lake, Michigan. Either a 6 or an 8-cylinder. This is a 8-cylinder. Would cost you $1,230 in 1948. Basically unchanged still from the 1942 cars. Though this was the last year for the old-fashioned Ford transverse leaf springs that Ford had used since the Model T days. Ford used that arrangement since 1909 until this year. This is 1948 Buick Super Sedan owned by Nick Chapakis of Saline, Michigan. 8-cylinder engine. What it costs new? $2,100. Anything, Bill?
The Super is the intermediate model, of course, but it has a full torpedo body and, of course, the notchback that goes with it. I will say that as a designer, this is one of my all-time favorite Buicks. Perhaps my favorite Buick, and it influenced a tremendous number of other designs. You might see the bouncing fender line. The front fender goes clear back and then the rear fender bounces. Influenced a lot of cars, especially Jaguar, the English car, which came out a few years later with very, very similar fender lines. MGTC. This car really sort of started the sports car fad in America. It was the first real thoroughbred sports car to be imported in the United States, and then a few years later Jaguar came in with the 120 and the Austin Healey.
These cars even in a sense influenced the Corvette and the Thunderbird in that General Curtis LeMay was friends with, I can't remember his name, head of General Motors, suggested to the head of GM that, you know, his soldiers were loving these sports cars, maybe he ought to come up with one, and in a sense that's how the Corvette came about. So there is sort of a direct lineage there.
Well, I remember I drove one of these many, many years ago in the rain, and I made a right turn, and because the front fender sticks out so far and doesn't come down over the wheel, I ran through a puddle and I ran right into my own splash, you know, and I never got over that. I never turned right again in an MG in the rain.
140 is a 1949 Buick Roadmaster, two-door sedanette owned by Alan Rattel. This Buick is number 141 in front of me here. Yes. 1949 Buick Roadmaster sedan owned by Peter Watson of Royal Oak. 143 is a 1949 Cadillac Series 62 convertible owned by Dale and Jeanette Behringer of Howell, Michigan. 49 Chevrolet Styline Deluxe two-door sedan owned by Jack and Cheryl Kimberly of Akron, Ohio. Price there either. Well, I guess we can't do price comparison, so what do you got to say, Bill?
Well, a couple of things. The fastback over here on the Buick, at this stage now, you're looking at the big Buick, the Roadmaster, the top of the line, and the fastback is available only in a two-door. The four-door now is the full torpedo body, which was sort of the rival body shape. Then you come back to the center car here, which of course is also a Roadmaster. It is the full torpedo body, the notchback, which ultimately would win out over the fastback. And in this year too, this was the first year of GM's really new post-war bodies. Notice that the front fender line now streams right through to the back. Yeah. Bill Mitchell tells a story about that fin, by the way, that the Cadillac general manager didn't like it, and he kept telling him to make it smaller. So what Mitchell did is the one on the far side he would make bigger. So when the general manager would come in the next time, he'd say, "See, we made it smaller," and he'd look over at the other one. Oh yeah, okay.
So he had a different.
It wound up the way it is.
Is 1949 Chrysler Windsor convertible.
This looks like an original car too. Is that right?
Roger Castor of New Dundee, Canada. Car 146. 1949 Chrysler Windsor Club Coupe owned by John Goschalk of Toledo, Ohio.
There we go.
148. Never ordered those optional kids. Is a 1949 Dodge Wayfarer Roadster owned by John Connor of Sterling Heights.
Yeah, and these are Chrysler's first all-new bodies in the after the war. In answer to GM and Ford's. Actually, Chrysler's all-new bodies were the most conservative of the big three in that respect. Ford was very radical, GM was somewhere in the middle, and Chrysler's was the most conservative.
1949 Packard. This is fastback styling.
This is definitely fastback styling. In fact, this is kind of the culmination, really, of the fastback. I think fastbacks were made as late as, maybe 51 or 2, but this is the era of the fastback, is the late 40s. This is close to fully streamlined teardrop cars as American design ever got.
If I remember correctly. Thank you very much. Thank you. Really nice.
Great grille shape, slick car, very smooth.
Oh no, I guess we're done, Bill.
I don't believe it.
Yeah.
My partner today is Roger Wojtowicz, who is a Ford emissions engineer, still actively on the staff there. And we're going to try to get this thing underway right away because the clock is running fast on all of us.
Okay, first up we have a 1950 Ford station wagon. 1950 was the second year that Ford used its all-new styling body shell and chassis. We can see that this station wagon has genuine wood side panels, although the body is mainly built of steel.
And this is an early 1950 model in that it has got wood on the tailgate as well as the body sides, and has a spare tire cover. In the middle of the year 1950, Ford reworked its wagon a little bit, put in some flat folding rear seats, and took the wood graining off the tailgate and made the tire cover an optional feature. And at that point they started calling their wagons Country Squire, which is a name that was long associated with Ford wagons. It is, yeah.
Okay, the first Buick that's coming up is indeed a 1950 model, and it's a Super. four-door sedan brought up by Al and Jen Weatherly of Macomb, Michigan. In 1950, Buick redid its lines completely and had all new bodies. And it was quite a departure from their 1949 styling, which was impressive enough, but 1950 styling even gave it a more big look, a lower look, and a longer look.
And also what they called the bumper bar grill, which integrated the grill bars with the bumper, and those were of especially heavy stock, where the grill both served as a grill and a bumper. It was a one-year thing, and the kids of that era, of which I was one, called them bucktooth Buicks. All Buicks of that era were powered by straight-eight engines. Nearly all of them had Dynaflow automatic transmission, although it was optional on the Special and Super. The Super in front of us has got not only many of Buick's accessories, but it has what we call period accessories, which were purchased from local auto supply stores. Candy apple red, he tells me. I don't believe that's a regulation 1950 Buick color. Maroon maybe, but not candy apple red.
Okay, next up we have number 168, which is a 1950 Ford Custom. And this is a two-door sedan brought up by Jerry Kirk of Brooklyn, Michigan. And the black Ford Custom, which is also a two-door sedan, brought up by Tom Wickert of Livonia, Michigan. And also the 1950 Mercury behind it, which is a four-door sports sedan. 1950 is the second year of Ford's completely redesigned car lines, both Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln. You can see that, you probably can't see because we don't have a 49 in front of us, but the 1950, they were billed as being 50 ways new and 50 ways finer. They had a lot of changes that were actually probably supposed to come out in the 49 model year, but they were much improved over the 49 Fords, because the 49 Fords had to kind of be rushed into production at an early date. The 1950s took care of a lot of the complaints that people had of road noise, wind noise, and dust entering the passenger compartment. And one of the most important things they did also style-wise was they hid the fuel cap behind a little door flap to give it a lot smoother look on the side. This is also the first year that the Ford Crest appeared on the deck lid and the hood of the Ford line. Now the 50 Mercury is also in its second year of basically all new 49 design. And it has an interesting door arrangement because in that era most of the doors were hinged in the front, and the 50 Mercury's doors on the four doors open barn door style. In other words, they open from the center, so the rear doors are actually hinged to the rear.
The Mercury had similar transmission selections, but used a larger engine than the Ford. It was V8 only, 255 cubic inches, 110 horsepower, while the Ford was only 100 horsepower. The Mercury was also 4 inches longer in wheelbase and about 10 inches longer overall.
Next up we have a 1950 Crosley CD brought in by Richard Wanasirski of Plymouth, Michigan.
And Mr. Crosley conceived the idea of a small car actually before World War II, and the original Crosleys were even smaller than this one and powered by two-cylinder engines. The front windows are sliding, the rear are fixed, and the top rolls back sort of like a roll-top desk. The thing is really a two-door sedan that's had a little cutting done on it. They also were the only car made in the United States with an overhead camshaft engine. It was only rated at 26 horsepower, but out of 44 cubic inches, that's less than a liter, about 3/4 of a liter. That's quite a amount of horsepower for that period.
Next up we have a 1951 Volkswagen 1100. This is a two-door brought in by Craig Elam of Centerline, Michigan. These were early years for Volkswagen in the United States. They imported exactly 2 units in 1949. So the 1951, it was still kind of a curiosity on U.S. streets. It's quite a bit smaller than the average American car at that time. And the early Volkswagens can be differentiated from the later ones because they have divided rear windows, 2-piece rear windows. And this one has the import style semaphore traffic indicators.
The Volkswagen was a 1100cc four-cylinder horizontally opposed air-cooled engine in the rear. It was a highly aerodynamic car for its period, and you can see by looking at it why they've nicknamed them Beetles.
Okay, next up we have 1952 Studebaker Deluxe Champion two-door brought in by Michael Pulaski of Livonia, Michigan, and also a 1952 Studebaker Champion two-door brought in by Henry Pazinski, Dearborn Heights, Michigan.
These are both the Champion Deluxe, which was the most popular member of the Champion family. In fact, probably the most popular member of the Studebaker family. As Roger indicated, they had a V8 engine in their larger car, the Commander, and then the Land Cruiser, which was stretched 4 inches longer than the rest of these, but came only in four-door sedans. And one final point is that 1952 was to Studebaker Corporation what this year is to Ford. It was their 100th anniversary since they got their start making Conestoga wagons and various horse-drawn vehicles. Can't say Detroit was Studebaker because they were from down there where Notre Dame is located, South Bend, Indiana.
Next up we have a 1952 Styline Deluxe two-door sedan brought in by Bob Marshall, Troy, Michigan.
That's a Chevrolet in case anybody didn't catch it.
And this is a 52 model, which is very close to the 51 in styling. There's slight differences in trim, and the parking lights are a little bigger in a 52. But what they were starting to do at General Motors back then is they were starting to pick up the fender lines in the back a little bit. And although those rear fenders look like they're separate units or components, they're actually all part of a single quarter panel.
Another point that's worth making about this car is that the 52s were built right at the height of the Korean War, and because of restrictions on nickel and zinc and copper and some of those metals, the original chrome on these cars was very thin, almost transparent, and I have a feeling that Mr. Marshall has probably had to have most of the chrome pieces on this car redone. This is Gerald Doherty of Plymouth, Michigan, and he's bringing his 1951 Studebaker Champion Deluxe two-door sedan. So now that needle-nosed aircraft-inspired front end was also a hallmark of the 1950 car, but changed slightly for 51. But one other point about the 1951 Studebaker is that it was the second best year ever in Studebaker's history for sales. Part of that was spurred on, I think, by fear of the industry shutting down because of the Korean War, much as it had 10 years earlier because of World War II.
Next up we have a 1953 Buick. And I believe this is a supermodel brought in by Gil and Penny Mervis of St. John's, Michigan. This is called a Buick Riviera because it is a hardtop body style, which means it has no center B-pillar. Buick was first to introduce the hardtop body style, or among the first, in 1949, and shortly it became a styling sensation, very much in demand.
Another thing you will note on this car is that it is equipped with wire wheels. Wire wheels had sort of gone out of fashion in the industry after about 1936, but thanks to the European sports car influence, such as that of the MG that you people saw a little while ago, wire wheels made a surging comeback in about 1953 to 5 period.
Okay, this is a 53 Ford custom line brought in by Robert Bailey of Berkeley, Michigan. And the wheels usually match the predominant body color, so that's why it would have the light green wheels.
That's
and
correct.
It's also powered by the famous Ford V8, Jim, which I think this version was in its last year in the U.S.
The L-head, the side valve Ford V8, 110 horsepower, 239 cubic inch, was in its last year that year in the U.S., although the Canadians continued to build it through 1954.
It is in fact a 53 Kaiser Manhattan, brought in by Walter and Nancy Blankets In 1951, they extensively restyled their car line, and this 1953 example reflects that restyling. You can see it's got a rather high roof line, but yet it looks real sleek. And the window line is also very high, so it kind of gives you good visibility.
The thing that probably hurt Kaiser Frazer the most once the post-war demand was over was that the car was overpriced versus what it offered. In terms of interiors, riding comfort, and probably quality, it matched everything else. But when Oldsmobile and Buick were selling powerful V8s, and the best Kaiser could do was a 118 horsepower 6, it just didn't quite cut it.
This is a Fleetwood 60 Special brought in by Alan and Sue Daly of Ann Arbor, Michigan. You can see that it's got an extended wheelbase, and it's got the characteristic louvers on the rear quarter that designate it as a 60 Special. And the reason it has the rear vents just under the rear window is because the air conditioning unit is mounted in the trunk instead of under the hood like it is in present day cars. So actually the air is blown in from the back forward through the clear plastic tubes that you can see visible through the rear window. And also with this car, it has tinted glass to go along with the air conditioning. And I can see on the dashboard, it's got the electronic eye that dims the headlights automatically.
Starting in it was 160 horsepower, and starting in 1952, the horsepower started jumping up about 20 horsepower each year. So it was 210 in this one.
Okay, next up we have a 1953 Hudson, brought in by Douglas Eds of Westland, Michigan. And Jim, I can see that this particular Hudson is in fact a Hornet.
Oh yes, the Hornet was the image car for Hudson. It was the top of the line, and when introduced in 1951, it had the largest six-cylinder engine in any American car, and Hudson's dominated the stock car racing in America thanks to the Hornet engine and the low silhouette, low center of gravity that they had.
Hudson's featured the mono-built body, and it was actually a body and frame unit, and that's what gave it its tremendous strength and really good handling, low center of gravity. Next up we have a 1953 Jaguar XK120 SE, which in this case stands for Special Equipment. This is a roadster brought in by Lee Jacobson of Dearborn, Michigan. Lee has also demonstrated the unique Jaguar sound. Jaguars were six-cylinder powered, but they had that very distinctive low rumble.
The XK120 also had a long-standing reputation of holding the highway speed record for the world, which was set in Belgium in the spring of 1949. This car came out in '48 of 132.6 miles per hour. 110, he said. Well, that's enough. In 1953, Kaiser Industries, which was Henry J. Kaiser's main operation, purchased Willis Overland, the Jeep people down in Toledo, and they merged them together as Willys Motors, and they moved the operation to Toledo over the winter of 53-54. So the 54 Kaiser was late in arriving, but when it finally got here, you could see, after comparing it with the last Kaiser that we saw, that they had updated the styling. They put a front end on it that was very reminiscent of Buick. They wrapped around the rear window and did some things to the tail lamps, and then to make up for the sluggishness of the engine, they included a supercharger, which brought the horsepower up to 140, which, while still not at Oldsmobile and Buick level, was significantly better than it had been.
Next up, we have a 1954 Plymouth Belvedere convertible. It was originally just a name tagged on to its two-door hardtop, but by 1954, the Belvedere was the high-style, highest-priced series and highest trim level of the Plymouth line.
But Plymouth was sort of, as was all of Chrysler Corporation in 1954, sort of falling behind the trend lines a little bit. It was more compact than the competitive Ford and Chevrolet. Ford had the advantage also of a V8 engine, and in a way it was a a bit more stodgy, although Plymouth did their best to jazz the car up with a 54 model. Made the Dodge engine, which provided 10 more horsepower available, and they brought out the fully automatic Power Flight transmission at mid-season.
Next up, we have a 1954 Ford Victoria. 1954, there was quite a few firsts, and among them was the V8 engine that was completely new that year. And the Ford Victoria was the hardtop body style, so there's no center B-pillar.
As Roger pointed out, the big news this year was the overhead valve V8 engine. They also changed the front suspension. We're the first car in the Big 3 class to have ball joint front suspension, which is now standard on just about everything. Ford also had this duke out or duel with Chevrolet for first place, and they ended up the year having sold more cars to the general public than Chevrolet. But if you counted those sold and registered in dealers and manufacturers' names, Chevrolet sold more cars.
Next up, we have a 1954 Chrysler New Yorker. I think this is a essentially original car. And I think the owner pointed out in his display that even the fan belts, the exhaust system, and the hoses are original, which is very unusual. Just goes to show you how long these Chryslers can last.
Well, Chrysler's cars were typically over-designed compared with everybody else, and particularly in engineering features. So given a little tender loving care for many years and not too many miles, they end up being like this by the time they're 49 years. The 54 was the year that Ford tried to unseat Chevrolet from first place in sales, and I guess did technically. Well, Ford had a more advanced chassis and new V8 engine. Chevrolet was fully competitive with the 6, and in fact the Chevy 6 rivaled the Ford V8 in performance. With the Power Glide transmission such as this car has, it developed 125 horsepower, and according to the magazine tests would outrun a 130 horsepower Ford that weighed about the same. So shows you that figures can lie and liars can figure, I guess.
Next up, we have a 1954 Cadillac Eureka. Eureka is a hearse, and it's brought in by Tom and Marlene Hutch of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Professional cars were a significant part of Cadillac's business. Cadillac would sell its base chassis and many of its body panels, but outside converters would convert the body for professional use, such as funeral homes and flower cars.
Well, this is what they call a three-way table, and he's demonstrating that for you people on the right-hand side of the car. The table comes out, and the pallbearers put the casket in place from the front door of the funeral home, and it's rotated around, transported to the place of final resting, and then unloaded from the rear, usually, although it wouldn't have to be. The typical funeral car was a rear loader, so a three-way was considered a premium variation. This was the last year of the first Corvette design cycle. The Corvette started out as a General Motors Motorama show car in 1953, and by popular demand went on the market in late 53 and was available in only one color, all white. And that indicated that the new V8 engine was under hood, the 265 horsepower V8, which today is known loved by many as the small block Chevy. That was its first appearance. For Corvettes, it was especially tweaked, had a 4-barrel carburetor and a Wilder camshaft, and gave it outstanding performance. If the figures I read are correct, there were only 674 of these built in total.
This is a Bel Air 4-door sedan. 1955 was a watershed year for Chevrolet, and although the big 3 low-priced cars were all new that year in styling, Chevrolet was a clear winner because they were overdue for some modernization. Chevrolet in 1955 not only had a complete restyle, but they had a very Cadillac look to them.
And my Ford my Ford heartstrings were burned by this thing. I mean, it just was so overwhelming. The grille was inspired by the Italian Ferrari. It had those eyebrowed headlamps like the Cadillac, and a tail lamp that whole rear end treatment. It all fit together. It was absolutely, from an appearance standpoint, done right.
On the inside, you see it's developed a dual cove instrument panel. They lifted that off right off the Corvette. So it gave a real sporty flair to this basic low-price car. And they also had a deep-set steering wheel, which was a bit of a safety feature, and also the inside featured built-in armrests in the doors. So it was actually quite modern inside and had some features that you couldn't find in other low-priced cars of the time. There's two different body styles represented here. Jim, these look like they're both four-holers.
Yeah, and they're both the so-called C-body. They both are on the 127-inch wheelbase. And by 1955, the distinction between the Roadmaster and the Super had diminished a bit, because they're both offering now a 4-barrel carburetor with their V8 engine, 236 horsepower, which was substantial in that period. Also, the white car is a single tone, which was rather out of the ordinary in 1955. Everybody seemed to have a two-tone then, or a special style treatment.
And they have very distinctive roof lines that wrap under the rear window on the side. You'll note that the Roadmaster's wheel covers have the little 2-bar spinner, where the Super does not.
And Century, which had the smaller body and we're not seeing today. The Special was the one that really put them over the top, because that was the volume car. Not that these cars didn't do well, but the others appealed to more of a mass market.
Next up, Jim, we have a 1955 Ford Fairlane brought in by Eddie Allen of Ypsilanti, Michigan. 1955, Ford was quite extensively restyled over the 54 model that you saw just earlier.
That's true, and there's an interesting point about the two-tones. It seems that we've been talking a lot about two-tone today, but that was the 50s. This is an early 55, because you see the color scheme goes light, dark, light, dark.
As he exits, you'll notice that he's got the vehicle equipped with dual exhaust. This is the first year that Ford offered factory dual exhausts on their regular car lines. Next up, we have a 1956 Ford Thunderbird brought in by Erica Knopf of Shelby Township, Michigan. Ford introduced the Thunderbird in the 1955 model year, and it was a slick two-seater roadster, but not really a roadster because it had roll-up windows, unlike the Corvette. So it had complete weather protection. So for 1956, they changed some things on the Thunderbirds to answer customer demands. One thing was they said, boy, when I look over my shoulder, it's poor visibility. They added portholes to the roof, which were an option. And the other thing is it had poor ventilation on the interior, so it got kind of stuffy inside, so they added the side vents on each front fender. And the last thing they did was they answered complaints of limited trunk space by mounting the spare tire on the outside. The first one was a 56 Ford Custom Line brought in by Carol Savorik of Dearborn Heights, Michigan. The second one, 1956 Ford Fairlane, run in by Ron Mayo of South Lyon, Michigan. The third one, which is the red and white one, is another 56 Ford Fairlane brought in by Betty Ritchie of Osseo, Michigan. 1956 was the second year of Ford's redesigned body and was actually a very good quality car and very reliable. It's kind of a high style. They rearranged the trim a little bit to give it like a smoother look. And they also, on the two-door Victoria in the middle, they gave it a lower roof line to make it look a little sleeker. Fords are still powered by V8 engines and 6 cylinders, and Fairlanes were standard, I believe, Jim, with V8 engines.
I believe you could still get a 6, but nobody bought them. I mean, it was on the books, but it was one of those things people didn't do. Typically, when a car has been totally restyled, the first year of a new model is the best looking, and after the first year, the car gets better in quality. With Ford, I think in the 55, 56 era, not only did the quality get better, but the styling improved, particularly the Victoria with its low roof line.
Believe it or not, this Cadillac Series 62 would be a lower level Cadillac, although this is a Coupe de Ville model. Coupe de Ville was a nicer trimmed two-door Cadillac, and they also came out with the Sedan de Ville, which was a higher level trim four-door as well.
Well, this particular, the Coupe de Ville, sold for $423 more than the regular coupe. Now, $423 was a pile of change in 1956.
And the Coupe de Ville is noted on the front fenders because the owners generally wanted people to know that they spent a little bit extra money on their Cadillac.
Let's see its closest competitor roll in a minute, and Roger will begin the introduction.
Next up, we have a 1956 Packard 400 brought in by Doug and Karen Markham of Livonia, Michigan. 1956 marked the last year of what we call the real Packard. These cars were actually designed as premium senior cars, and this vehicle is probably Cadillac's pretty direct competitor.
The Packard, unlike the Cadillac, was still having to deal with an older body design. The basic shell of this car came out as a 1951 model, but Packard did its best to freshen it. For 55, they carved in a wraparound windshield, modified the rear window, and changed the quarter panels and the front fenders, and had a leveling system built in that if you loaded your trunk or added passengers, a motor would crank the torsion bars and level off the car. But the bad news was this was the last of the true Packards, and it saddened a lot of automotive people, and if we didn't get the impact of it at the time, we certainly have since.
The 1957 Chevrolets. The first one is a Bel Air coupe brought in by Gerald Switzer of Beverly Hills, Michigan. The second one is a Bel Air convertible brought in by George Pierce of Clinton Township, Michigan. 1957 reflects the third year of Chevrolet's basic 1955 body design, and it was probably changed as extensively as you could change a body style without going to an all-new body.
Okay, well, this is sort of a mild hot rod with a 220 horsepower 283 with one 4-barrel. He tells me this is a 270. That was a 270 horsepower, which means it has two 4-barrel carburetors and a Duntov camshaft. Ordered as a hot rod, used as a hot rod, and now it's just a trophy wagon.
This is a Ford Sunliner, which is the name given to Ford soft-top convertibles. This car, I believe, would be probably torch red and raven black.
Ford built 77,778, nearly 80,000 of these, while Chevy built but less than 50,000 of the cars like the black one. So Ford was clearly the dominant convertible seller.
It's also interesting to note that although we would call them fins on that 57, Ford called them twin-canted blades.
Yeah, Ford did like to call their fins blades, didn't they?
Yes. Next up, 1958 Cadillac, and also a 58 Cadillac Series 62 brought in by Chris Harmon of Columbus, Ohio.
260 specials.
Okay, the next one, the black Cadillac is a 1958 Series 60 Special, and the last one is a 1958 Cadillac Fleetwood 60 Special as well, the gray vehicle.
This was the cheap Cadillac, and I say that with a smile in my voice and quotes, because at $4,784 in 1958 money, it was still a lot of car. They sold more Coupe de Villes, which were more expensive, and the best seller in the line was the Sedan de Ville.
1958 was also the first full year that the industry went over to quad headlights. So they went to the 4-lamp system, which the outer beam is for low beam use in the city, and all 4 beams come on when you're in the country and you want to see farther down the road. The black vehicle is a 1958 Renault 4CV. During the 1950s, kind of starting with Volkswagen in the very early 50s, imported economy cars kind of had some run of popularity. Towards the late 50s, they became more popular because in 1958, when this vehicle was brought over, it was a recession year and people started looking for better fuel economy and more efficient packaging.
It was a water-cooled, mounted in the rear, 28 horsepower. The car had an 83-inch wheelbase and was only 142 inches long. That's less than the wheelbase of a Cadillac limousine. Had a port of entry price of $1,345.
You know, Jim, when I was a kid, I used to see these very rarely, but the thing that always fascinated me is the retention mechanism for the little hubcaps. They put a bolt right through the center, and it was very easy to get at. Okay, this is a 1958 Metropolitan. The Metropolitan was marketed by Nash Motors, and it was actually brought into this country first in 1954. Basically, I believe went through 1962 without any general body changes.
It was originally a Nash. It was originally called the Nash Metropolitan, and then after American Motors was formed, it could be sold. It was sold for a while in 1955 and 6 with Hudson or Nash badging, and then after that, it became just plain Metropolitan. Yep.
First vehicle is a 1958 Mercury Park Lane, and the second one is a 1958 Mercury Monterey. The Park Lane series, I believe, was going against the Buick a little bit because it was an enlarged Mercury and had some of its own distinctive styling and ornamentation.
Yes, it was. It was 3 inches longer in wheelbase, and yeah, that can be seen by people sitting in the stands. Even though the Monterey, the green car, is not a four-door sedan, you can't really make a direct comparison, but notice where the rear, the trailing edge of the front door stops, there is a large gap there to the wheel opening. Were this a Monterey or a Montclair or a standard Mercury, that door cut would be tight to the wheel opening. There were actually 4 levels of Mercury in 1958. There was one they called the Standard Mercury that came out late because they needed a lower priced model. The Monterey, the green car, was the bread and butter. There was the Montclair, which was a fancy Monterey in the middle, and then there was the Park Lane, which was, he said, Roger said, intended to compete with perhaps the Buick Special and also the Oldsmobile 98.
In addition to keyboard control, I believe both of these vehicles have a padded dash as well. The convertible is interesting because it has a wraparound rear window. This is quite unusual for the time because they were trying to get more visibility in convertibles, and the vinyl rear plastic window was kind of a new feature. So Mercury actually had it wrap around, which was kind of unusual for the time. Okay, Jim, next up we have a 1958 MGA running by Steve Holliday of Oakland, Michigan. They had the TC and the TD, and the MGA represented the new MG with new styling, and was quite an impressive looking sports car.
And 68 horsepower. It was also longer and represented a clean break with the past, yet it was sporty enough to not offend any longtime MG fans.
Okay, the first one up is a 1959 Pontiac Parisienne, followed up by a 1959 Pontiac Catalina two-door sedan. Pontiac had a big year in 1959. It was Motor Trend's Car of the Year and featured all new styling as well as all the other GM cars of that period as well. Interesting thing about the first car, which is a convertible, a Parisienne may be unfamiliar with many of you as a Pontiac series, and that's because this is a Canadian version. The Pontiacs in Canada, I believe, Jim, had Chevrolet chassis.
They were basically Chevrolets under the body, that's right.
And although Pontiac was trumpeting their wide track design in 1959, the Canadian Pontiacs having Chevrolet chassis didn't have that feature.
Including Chevrolet. And before the Auto Pact of 1965, the Canadian industry was only able to build cars for Canada. The importation of American cars was met with rather high duty, so GM, Ford, and Chrysler all had special cars for the Canadian market.
But there's one important difference in this two-door that I can see from here, and that's the little ornament that's on the front fender that says Tri-Power.
I saw that too, Roger. That means triple carburetors, and it possibly even has a special camshaft. So with the 389 cubic inch Pontiac engine, you're talking well in excess of 300 horsepower with that that particular arrangement, no matter what the camshaft is.
And this also marked the first year that Pontiac adopted the split grille. And they still use a form of the split grille treatment today.
That became a trademark, very much so. And the split fins were a 1 year only, but very distinctive.
Okay, next up we have a 1959 Buick Electra 225. After that we have a 1959 Cadillac and also another 1959 Cadillac. These three vehicles represent the top of the GM line for 1959. Buick was always encroaching on Cadillac as far as prestige through the 1950s and even earlier than that. The Electra 225, I believe that's the first year that we saw the Electra series, and 225 refers to its overall length. So this is a Buick Electra among Electras. Cadillac has become kind of a cult item, mainly because of its fins, and this is the highest they ever got.
Well, actually, at that point, it was the high point of Cadillac fins. Following that, they progressively lowered them 1 inch each year until 1965, when they were sort of absorbed back into the quarter panels.
The last four-door, you can see that it's got 6-window styling. It's got the little triangular quarter windows behind the door windows. That was something that was not offered across all GM lines. I believe that Cadillac offered it and Buick as well.
Buick Electra 225 and Cadillac were the only ones with the 6-window hardtop sedans. You could get a Cadillac with a flat roof and a severely wrapped rear window, and that was called a 4-window sedan DeVille.
And you'll notice that the parking light styling repeats the quad headlight styling, which repeats the taillight styling. Everything is in twos.
And then the radiator grille is repeated on an insert in the rear bumper too, which we'll see as they pull away.
Okay, next we go to a more sporty offering from General Motors in 1959. This is a Chevrolet Corvette brought in by Jeff Kostecki of Westland, Michigan. And they took the louvers off the hood, and they took the chrome streaks off the deck lid. And actually the 59 is a very nicely styled car. The two-tone insert on the sides was seen on most Corvettes, although I believe it was still an option at that time.
And there was a variety of engines. All of them were 283 cubic inch V8s. They started with a single 4-barrel at 220 horsepower and worked their way up to a fuel-injected 290 horsepower edition with a Duntov cam.
Next up, we have an MG from 1959.
The twin cam came out this year. It was 1600 cc rather than 15, and it had a 9.9 to 1 compression ratio, which was pretty high even then, but of course they had leaded gasoline, and so it wasn't the problem that it might be today. And the horsepower was 107, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for an MG it was close to record levels, other than those speed record cars they ran from time to time. And according to the figures I found, the twin cam sold the list price at $3,345, whereas the pushrod engine was nearly $900 less.
Well, Jim, that concludes our program for today.
I believe it does. Thank you for coming out.
Hope you enjoyed it.
And all you dads, have a good Father's Day. And for those of you interested in trucks, we'll be back tomorrow.
Just love this 1952 Ford garbage truck. Yeah, too bad I can't find the owners of this truck. I have a couple of nephews, about 5 and 3, who are just crazy about garbage trucks. It's 5:30 in the evening. A lot of the owners have gone home. A lot of cars are getting wrapped up for the day. Look at this 1942 Cadillac 7-passenger sedan. Look at those bullet taillights on there. Pretty beautiful car.
My name is Lee Jacobson from Dearborn, Michigan. This is a 1953 XK120 SE or modified Roadster Jaguar, and it's a special equipment model, and Special equipment really denoted a larger engine, dual exhaust, and wire wheels. Most Jaguars of this period had the skirts in the back and solid disc wheels. The horsepower was around 200 horsepower, had a dual overhead cam, and this car is fairly original. It was located in a garage in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it sat there since 1964 with a bad fuel pump, but over the past 2 or 3 years, touched up the paint, the interior is original, did a little bit of rechroming, and it runs great. They were trying to get a sedan done for an auto show in France, and they couldn't do it, so they told the engineers, listen, we got this great dual overhead engine, build us a body. They had about 2 weeks, and they built this body for the show, and it was such a hit that they were overwhelmed with orders. They had, so the first 200 Jaguars like this are made entirely out of aluminum with wood bodies, and then they went to steel stampings.
Okay, my name is Ronald Sheehan. This is a 1953 International Harvester panel truck. It's called a R110 series, makes it a heavy-duty half-ton. It's actually, it's a panel truck is what they call it. It's not a car like a sedan delivery. It was made by International. It was the first year that they had the IH in the emblem. It's considered the man on the tractor. That's why it was called that. When I bought it, I found it in Hemmings Motor News. I paid $1,500 for it 8 years ago. It's now worth $12,000. I love it. Going the other way, instead of buying a new car and getting nothing for it. All it needed when I found it was tires and paint. It had 29,000 original miles on it. It now has 113,000 miles on it. I use it every day for my business. My name's is on the side of the truck. I'm a handyman.
There's a couple of Plymouths from 1954. Laden cars, remade. Limited. And interestingly, in '59, the Pontiacs had what they call the rabbit ear fins, like dual fins on each side. In '60, they had just a remnant of that with the taillights, how they come out. So it's like a remnant of the rabbit ear fins from '59. And here's the '59 Pontiac a year earlier. This is the '59 Pontiac Catalina.
First, if we could have the children come out. Of course, no organization is complete or will continue to survive without a younger generation coming up to follow in our footsteps. So we try to make sure that we have a complete family-oriented club, and so we wanted the children to come out and show you some of their unique machines. We have some very early wooden tricycle here in the front, and then you can see some later machines that are made with obviously with steel and iron. You can see that this still has carriage wheels, but now we have cranks attached to the front wheel. The invention is still up for grabs by the historians. There are discussions over who really invented the machines, but the two leading candidates are a father and son couple by the name of Chaux and another gentleman by the name of Pierre Lamont. This particular machine is a Pickering that was made in New York. It's a very early machine, early 1860s. To put this in perspective, time frame, you're talking right at the end of the Civil War for this vintage machine. And what evolved was what you see here is the ordinary or the high wheel bicycle. The major manufacturers in the United States, and the reign in the United States was about 1878. A gentleman by the name of Pope started the Pope Manufacturing Company, and the Columbia bicycle is the trade name. And the reign of the high wheel went till about 1892. And of course, the most often asked questions that we get are, how do you get on and how do you get off? So we'll answer those in reverse. Mr. Bugler, could we have the signal to dismount, please? Now you'll notice that there is a step back on the frame that most of the gentlemen were and a few of the ladies here were using to get on and off. So Bugler, could we have the signal to mount, please? Needless to say that the high wheel bicycle is a little bit dangerous to ride. Your weight is high and forward on the machines. And I don't know, can you do a forward dismount, John? Okay. Okay. One of the things that you'll notice when the people are riding is your legs are trapped underneath the handlebars. So if you hit an obstacle, or if you put on your brake too fast, as most of these bicycles do have a spoon brake that comes down on the top of the front wheel, you will go off the front. Now John's going to show you how that happens safely. If your legs are underneath the handlebars, you're tipped upside down on your head, and you do what is called a header. And if you truly do a header with any speed, you probably have yourself a trip to the hospital. The tricycle led the advancement in the chain. You'll notice, especially on the machine that's leading here, how large the chain is. At this vintage in time, they still are not strong enough, and they're very heavy to be used on a regular cycle every day. You have rack and pinion steering on this machine as well, another feature that is used in today's automobiles. And also, one of the key features that was developed for the tricycle was a differential, so that basically the rear gearing to allow both wheels to drive as you were turning. There were numerous attempts, as I mentioned, to make the high wheel bicycle safer. The two that you see here today are strictly American designs, with the large wheel in the rear and the small wheel in the front. The first one here is known as a Star, with the ratchet system and the levers. And the one in the rear is known as an Eagle, and it's basically truly a high wheel backwards with the rotary pedals. And I think Ben's going to do a few stunts here for us. You can see now, with these bicycles, you're not going to do a header, but you're going to do a rear ender or a tailer going off the back end. And I think Ben can dismount properly, probably showing us how to do it safely. Of course, that's how you have to dismount that machine anyways. John Boyd Dunlop reinvented the pneumatic tire. And it revolutionized the cycle industry, and of course was a key invention that was needed by the automotive industry as we move forward. You will see today, now that we have many cycles out here, we're back to wooden rims in many cases. And the ladies' machines have fenders and chain guards. Most of them are made of wood. And they have some sort of lacing guarding to prevent their skirts from getting caught in the spokes.